Uliana ЛУЩ-ПУРІЙ. I'm a PhD in philosophy, associate professor of Ivana Franko National University of Lviv, and I'm co-founder of the Ukrainian Institute for Happiness Research. So I will read my paper in order to make it brief and just say a few words then in Ukrainian. Тож я коротко зачитаю англійською свою доповідь і буквально кілька речень скажу українською. So my research is, the topic of my research is the Ukrainian happiness, the Ukrainian context of HOMO EUDAIMONICUS anthropological model. So my paper this time is not quite a traditional academic research presentation, but rather an essay representing my reflections and conclusions. But well, nothing was traditional this time because I was writing it during the air alarm. So indeed, it's very different from any of my previous conference papers. Within the framework of my postdoctoral thesis, I've started thinking about how to make the contemporary eudaimonism fit the Ukrainian social and cultural context. So the theory of eudaimonic happiness, that is the definition of happiness as the good and meaningful life, the life oriented towards goal and social relations. So how to make the anthropological model of HOMO EUDAIMONICUS work in the Ukrainian context? Eudaimonic definition of happiness as flourishing as the good and meaningful life has become so current and widespread in the Western culture in the end of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century, not by accident. It is the logical consequence of social, economic, cultural processes in Europe and North America that led to it. Who is HOMO EUDAIMONICUS? That is the person who seeks for eudaimonia, the good and meaningful life, a person who prioritizes the quality of life over income, who develops ecological awareness, who works on her sense of purpose and belonging, who makes efforts for sustainable development. This anthropological model is indeed a product of developed countries, meaning sovereign states with a mature economy and technologically advanced infrastructure. The 21st century HOMO EUDAIMONICUS, the one who is conquering the internal freedom, who is paving the way of one's own authenticity while feeling sated and safe in the civilized world. Is the offspring, the HOMO EUDAIMONICUS is the offspring of the past generations who were struggling, who were standing for external freedoms of vote, speech, gender, etc. HOMO EUDAIMONICUS is also a mentally mature type of a person, is the one who has overcome hedonistic strives for material goods and pleasures and makes a conscious decision in favor of one's own self-improvement and self-development. So as for Ukrainian social and cultural context, the context of a country with developing economy and now with the war, there had been a logical grounded worry before the beginning of war on the 24th of March 2022 that HOMO EUDAIMONICUS anthropological model might have not taken roots because of being ultimately untimely and inorganic to the Ukrainian context. It had seemed that people hadn't yet enjoyed the income enough to prioritize the quality of life, hadn't yet been sated to get rid of hedonistic strives. However, since the beginning of war, it has become obvious that Ukrainians have made their way towards HOMO EUDAIMONICUS model and made it in their own way. The war has revealed the true Ukrainian type of happiness that was shadowed by Russian propaganda and xenophobic narrative through centuries. Russians created a narrative of Ukrainians as sad and unhappy people singing sorrowful songs. But what is the Ukrainian kind of eudaimonic happiness? Here are some features of the Ukrainian happiness, or the Ukrainian type of eudaimonic happiness that I've seen during this war period. First of all, freedom and authenticity are the foundation of our happiness. Our happiness is impossible without freedom, and each of us is ready to sacrifice life for it. And now it's not a metaphor anymore. That is the reality that the world witnesses. Second, our happiness correlates with morality. To be happy for Ukrainians is indeed to exercise virtues and live a moral life. The proofs are seen at multiple examples. The culture of our soldiers, our army, volunteering activities, everyday communication and support between people. For the Ukrainian happiness, for the Ukrainians, their happiness is incompatible with betrayal of their moral standards for safety. We are happy by living a virtuous life, by keeping our dignity even under physically unbearable circumstances. In the national scale, Ukrainians have shown the respect to freedom and happiness of others, which is the moral limitation of happiness of individuals. So as we have mentioned before during the conference, there is a moral limit for individual happiness. Your happiness ends where the happiness of another person starts, and your freedom ends, like the limit of your freedom is where the freedom of another person starts. So you cannot gain your happiness by means of suffering of other people. Unlike unhealthy maniac desire of Russians to make the rest of the world suffer in order to compensate for their inferiority complex, Ukrainians fight for freedom, right of self-determination, and right for flourishing of all communities. That is actually this kind of social happiness that we became happy when happy communities are created around us, because the happiness when one country wants to dominate other societies and make them unhappy, that is not a healthy, from psychological perspective, medical perspective, that is not a healthy definition of happiness and healthy needs. Third, we have passed the marshmallow test. We have rejected a short-term safety and have chosen a long-term sustainable happiness for all future Ukrainian generations. Fourth, Ukrainian happiness is deeply rooted in a sense of belonging and a sense of meaning. Our common purpose transcends, goes beyond individual interest of each of us, unlike the case of Russians, whose basic physical survival instinct paralyze them and make them obedient and indifferent to the suffering of other people, Our common Ukrainian purpose is the happy life, not only for each of us, but the happy life together and the happy life for the future generations. Our sense of belonging now is stronger than ever, since we are united through deep, negative, and traumatic emotional experience of war. None of us distantiates or fences oneself off this negative experience. We all live through this negative experience together, getting tied in a strong and resilient community. There are obviously more features to mention and analyze, but I'll stop here for now. So to conclude, the Ukrainian experience of happiness, of eudaimonic happiness as flourishing, is so unique in the context of war experience, that peaceful civilized world has already forgotten. And at the same time, the value foundation of the Ukrainian happiness is the same with the one of all three democratic communities. Eudaimonic happiness is a healthy and efficient way to coexist, cooperate, and co-flourish in the contemporary world. But at the same time, the happy future and sustainable development of free democratic countries are at stake because of unhealthy, necrophilic paradigm of Russian society. So let's unite our efforts to win for the flourishing and happy future of the whole world. So thank you, and please, I would be glad to answer any questions. Hope I didn't exceed the limit. If there are no questions, we also will be grateful if you could write them in the chat. And now we move to the next speaker, who is Professor, Researcher, and Aggregate Professor Cristina Montesi from the Department of Economics, University of Perugia, Italy, with the topic Distribution of Wealth and Human Happiness, the Legacy of William Thompson. Please, Professor Montesi.
Thank you very much for the invitation. And of course, I'm very sorry for all the tragedy you are living. And I express my my sentiment to be near Ukrainian people. And I hope and I say, may the force be with you, like in Star Wars film. Of course, the force is a mystical and a spiritual energy. Of course, it's not only the physical strength. So I'm going to introduce my paper, which analyzes the figure of William Thompson. William Thompson was an Irish intellectual who was born in 1785 and died in 1833. He was very eclectic. He was a philosopher, a social scientist, a social reformer, a defender of women's rights, but above all, he was a moral and a very radical economist. He was, in fact, the pioneer of Marx's theory of surplus value, as Marx explicitly admits, though Thompson's discovery of surplus value theory was made with less analytical rigor than Marx. This forerunner intuition of Marx's theory of surplus value should not allow Thompson to be placed among Ricardian socialists, the group to which he has erroneously brought back by some scholars in the history of economic thought. Thompson gave, in fact, an anti-capitalistic twist to the labor value theory of David Ricardo. This turning point led Thompson to devote himself to the study of an innovative theory of justice connected with happiness. His working life, first as a merchant and then as a very open-minded landlord, was consistent with his theory of justice, as you can read in the paper. Thompson's main research topic can be deduced from the title of his most important scientific work, an inquiry into the principles of distribution of wealth most conducive to human happiness, printed in 1824. My paper shows that the search for the natural laws of distribution of wealth, which can ensure the achievement of the greatest quantity of human happiness, led Thompson to an original combination of Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism, Robert Owen's socialism, and finally Ada Smith's theory of value, not David Ricardo's theory of value. Thompson gave his own interpretation of their ideas, though he was a very close friend of Bentham, and though he was one of the most important socialists of Owen's movement in Great Britain and in Ireland. Thompson took distance from Bentham on value topics, for instance, on the concept of happiness and on the non-subordination of equality principle to safety principle. Thompson meant mutual cooperation in a more democratic, feminist and reformistic direction than Owen's conception. And finally, Thompson embraced Adam Smith's theory of value, which identifies labor as the true source of value, as well as the real source of wealth and property, basing on this assumption the claim of workers' right to the whole product of his labor. For David Ricardo, labor was only a measure of value, not the origin of value. At microeconomic level, Thompson's legacy, still valid today, can be found in the anticipation inside its social system of mutual cooperation of the famous Rochdale principle, which would have become 20 years later the guiding principle of cooperative enterprises, integrated with the principle of public happiness, a civil economy notion. Thompson invokes Bentham's principle of utility at the very beginning of his inquiry as the guide principle of society. Utility is the pursuit of the greatest possible sum of human happiness, but shows a point of divergence with Bentham in the notion of happiness, because Thompson identifies very modernly happiness with well-being. According to Thompson, happiness is a state of well-being made of different items of good feeling experienced during a considerable space of time. Well-being depends on social institution and mostly on material condition, mostly on wealth. This is why no subject becomes more interesting for Thompson than the research of the natural laws of distribution of wealth, which can ensure the achievement of the greatest happiness of the greatest number, starting from some cornerstone of Bentham's utilitarianism, but with some caveats. Only free and voluntary exchange of goods and only free and voluntary exchange of productive factors can ensure happiness on both sides of a contract. So only free and voluntary labor can bring real happiness to workers and can increase motivation to work and labor's productivity. Wealth is produced by labor. Labor is the true source of value. Workers should have the right to appropriate the whole product of their labor, not only a miserable part of their labor, as in capitalistic system, which Thompson calls the insecurity system. And finally, the forced loss of most of the fruit of their work causes in workers a bigger loss of happiness than the corresponding increase of happiness in capitalists, with the result that the whole quantity of happiness will lessen. So equality of distribution ought to be the right rule to adopt. In Thompson's view, unlike Bentham, equality principle is not subordinated to security principle. They should march together, following the three natural laws of distribution of wealth, which consist in free labor, voluntary exchange, workers' control over the fruit of their labor. These natural laws, according to Thompson, should be carried out gradually through education and persuasion, not with violence. Thompson, like William Godwin, relied on the power of reason and on argumentative dialogue. Marx was very critical with the utopian socialism of Thompson for his belief in the possibility of a voluntary and pacific social change and for his lack of historical perspective. According to Thompson, the new economic and social model in which these natural laws can be more easily applied is mutual cooperation, an alternative to capitalistic system which is based on private property and competition. Looking at the pattern already traced by Robert Owen in the villages of cooperation based on the new Lanark model, Thompson prefigures voluntary association of people composed from 300 to 2,000 members, self-governed through democratic process by committees of males and females appointed by election. For many reasons, Thompson can be considered one of the major thinkers in the history of British feminists, on par with Mary Wollstonecraft, as we can read in the paper. And in this community, every working member becomes owner of the means of production, and this community will be provided also of a universal educational system and of a social assistance system. According to Thompson, the new system of mutual cooperation was a third way between capitalistic system and state ownership model. And this new model could overcome not only injustice, but also economic inefficiencies of capitalistic system and most of human vices. Some weakness can, however, be identified in Thompson's ideal community: the overconfidence in reason to change status quo, the problem of a non-chaotic transition from the old to the new social order, the problem of exogenous shocks, which can suddenly affect the community, undermining its self-sufficiency, and the problem of economic exchange among communities in case of shortage or in case of surplus of production, which could give rise to competitive dynamics. Today, cooperative enterprises are derived from the guidelines of the communities which Thompson has conceived. Thompson can be considered the ideal inspirer of a model of company very different from capitalistic enterprise. The cooperatives are based on a positive anthropology in strong contrast to the individualism and selfishness of Homo economicus, of neoclassical economy, and of neoliberalism. Cooperative enterprises put people at the core of their business, consider happiness as a relational good because happiness of each worker cannot be separated from happiness of the other members of the cooperative and from happiness of the community in which the cooperative works, answering to its social needs. The relational character of happiness, as the President Relation told us, means that happiness of each actor involved is dependent on the happiness of the other, as Thompson had perfectly understood. I quote him: "The happiness of the majority of productive classes, instead of being opposed to the happiness of the whole community, is connected with it. They are necessary to each other's well-being." Here, there is another difference between Thompson and Bentham. Overall happiness is not, like in Bentham view, the sum of individual pleasure. Therefore, it does not coincide with total good, but well-being is the fruit of the integration and interdependence of individual happiness with respect for common good. So Thompson's notion of happiness is very similar to public happiness of Antonio Genovesi and of Giacinto Dragonetti, former exponent of civil economy. Thompson, in his theoretical construction of his communities, has not only anticipated the Rochdale principles, which are still at the basis of modern cooperatives, but has also suggested integrating them with the principle of public happiness. So in company, in cooperative, you must introduce in the mission public happiness, relational happiness, an advice which could be seriously followed in their next updating. Finally, to go back to the foundative principle of mutual cooperation formalized by Thompson, can also be useful to avoid the risk of isomorphism of contemporary cooperative enterprises to capitalistic firms. Modern cooperatives should in fact preserve their original character character of being an instrument of economic democracy and of equality, and the place of corporate well-being in patrimonial and financial capitalism era, which is characterized by growing inequalities and labor exploitation, and in the digital capitalism epoch connoted by extra profit of private oligopolies. So that's all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, dear Professor Montesi, for an interesting research presentation. And we are asking, dear colleagues, because of the lack of time, if you have any questions or comments, please write them in the chat below, and we will share with the speakers, and you can receive the answer later on. So thank you again for participating for the second time already. Hope for further cooperation, and we are moving forward. I'm presenting the team of co-authors from Spain. So as far as I understand, Professor Manuel Escurido Calvo, am I correct?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
More or less, but this it's a very difficult surname. Okay.
Mm-hmm. So you will tell me how is it correct?
Escurido.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, and I will just pin, here it is, and Professor will actually present their work: environmental protection and community-based green solutions, social progress and collaboration. That is the result of the cooperation with his colleagues, Raquel Fernandez Gonzalez, PhD, University of Vigo, Spain, Lucia Fernandez Rumbo, right, University of A Coruña, and Felix Puime Guillen, is that correct?
Guillen.
Guillen, as assistant professor in business administration, University of A Coruña, Spain. So please, you're welcome. Do you have presentation to share?
Yes, I want to share my screen.
You are welcome to do that. There is a permission to share screens.
Okay.
Yes, we will see your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, 1 minute. Okay, in this way. Yeah. Okay. So good day, everyone. It's a pleasure to be present at this congress, for which our sincere thanks to the Ukrainian Institute for Happiness Research and to all the assistants from the universities of A Coruña and Vigo, the northwest of Spain. We will bring this collaboration that dealing with the challenge of environmental protection and community-based green solutions. We put the focus on the necessary conditions so that community management can be an option to taking into account when facing this challenge. So one of the main challenges facing humanity is the management of natural resources. A short-term vision, by definition, is myopic. In this case of overexploitation, resource depletion, and species extinction. Instead, if we take a long-term approach, the concern for the future and the next generation are always present, which means paying attention to the management of natural resources. From a basic economic point of view, the natural resources are one more input of the production processes, along with capital and labor, an input that has not been necessary to produce because nature provides. However, a more advanced economic analysis and study requires consideration not only of economic data, but also a physical, social, institutional, and technological need. On the other hand, these specific conditions indicate the need to contemplate in its study the natural conditions themselves, as well as the institutional conditions that define its exploitation processes. Regarding the natural conditions, from an economic point of view, we must consider two fundamental aspects: the physical or material properties and the temporary period of adjustment or renovation of its down. Regarding the first aspect, we differentiate between biological, mineral, energy, and environmental resources. The classification could be between living or inert resources. A special attention is given to the energy resources, where we can differentiate between the positive resources. They are limited. Example, oil, gas, coal, uranium, and flow resources without limit in principle. Okay, solar, hydraulic, wind energy, etc., etc. Regarding the second aspect, sorry. Regarding the second aspect, which differentiate, as we can see, renewable and non-renewable natural resources, depending on whether the rate of regeneration is economically significant or not. In the case of renewable natural resources, economic decisions will take into account the type of adjustment or temporary renewal of the resource, as well as its replacement speed. In some cases, such as solar energy, this rate of renewal is so fast that there is hardly any impact on later periods in time. In addition, the condition of human exploitation of natural resources also depend on institutional circumstances, and especially on the various forms of property that can be established historically, and that today condition human activity of them. So we can find, sorry, are you seeing my?
No, we do not see. Right now, we see it again.
Okay, sorry. Here, are you seeing that?
Yeah, we see the screen, introduction, conditions of human exploitation of resources.
Okay, yes.
This slide.
Sorry. I will stop this slide. So we can find next to the typical competitive situations, others where the monopolistic character predominates. There may be situation of common property or also situation of free access. In general, numerous cases in which property rights lack a precise definition of where there are no rating markets, although this does not imply that the resources, especially environmental ones, are not valued. And all this implies different behaviors of economic agents, different solutions to the problems. So, and all these questions are relevant, but they have not always been treated from a common theoretical body, although there are numerous attempts and scientists and studies for specific activities like mining, fishing, or forestry. One of the first approaches to this problem was carried by Robert Malthus. His pessimistic approach warned of growth in food production lower than population growth worldwide. So is the relation between arithmetic progression versus geometric progression that would lead to a collapse in natural resources. After Malthus, David Ricardo also adopts a pessimistic theory about the scarcity of natural resources and their ability to produce food. The land factor with diminishing returns induces the non-accumulation of capital, leads to the non-growth of production, non-population, and to ways of the subsistence level. Just John Stuart Mill predicts a more optimistic equilibrium state, although also limited by the scarcity of natural resources. Economic growth is only necessary in developing countries, while in developed countries, the fundamental question is the distribution of the income, but not its growth, not therefore the accumulation of capital in terms of more goods to consume. This would affect the well-being of future generations. Therefore, this idea makes him one of the forerunners of current conversionist approaches. Other author, William Stanley Jevons, in this theory of political economy in 1871, stated that the optimal allocation between two scarce resources is achieved when the marginal utilities are equal, laying the foundation of the marginal theory of value. He predicted the depletion of coal and thus at the end of English industrial development. Pigou in the economics of welfare, 1919, developed the concept of negative externality and as a theoretical basis for the pollution generated by economic activity. In order to internalize this negative externality, he determined the optimal level of tax that forces economic agents to include the cost of environmental damage in their production cost. We have known that as Pigouvian tax. And Harold Hotelling, in the end, in their The Economics of Sustainable Resources, 1951, drawing implicitly of the work of Jevons, established basic rules that indicate where a non-renewable resource should be extracted and the optimal trajectory of extraction. In short, the concern among these economists, last of 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, focus on the use of land, its ability to produce food, and the possible depletion of non-renewable resources. The concern for these uses was reborn in the second half of the 20th century after the energy crisis of the 70s, but also with the development of mathematical tools that allowed the development of new and more analytical models. So the economics of natural resources is based on neoclassical economics, although it has been incorporating approaches and contributions from other scientific disciplines. So among them, the relevance of institutional factors stand out, which define the rules of use and the adoption of incentives that influence the conduct of economic agents in their management of natural resources. In addition, the study of common resources constitutes a highly relevant research agenda. So Armstrong argues that a common resource is characterized by the difficulty of splitting beneficiaries and the rivalry of use, and many natural resources meet these characteristics. From her work, Governing the Commons, the Evolution of Institutions for Collective Action, 1990, and to his most recent contributions, Armstrong builds the concept of social ecological system. In his own words, in her own words, is a subset of social systems in which some of the relationships of interdependence between human beings and measure through interaction with human biological and biophysical units. This socio-ecological system having a more complete way of dealing with the resource management, seeking to encompass the complex reality that governs them through a multi-level approach.
I'm very sorry, dear professor, for interrupting. We still see the slide of presentation named Introduction.
Oh, sorry. Okay, one moment. You can see?
Yes, we can see already. Number 4, Tragedy of the Common Social Norms. Mm-hmm.
Okay, is the and now?
The continued use of a common resource, we see.
Okay, so if I'm moving, you can see?
Yes, it is moving.
Okay, so, sorry for
That's okay. Technical issues are usual.
Yeah, so in this point, for decades, one of the main challenges for economists has been how to limit the use of natural resources based on the assumption that their continued use by a large number of users means the degradation. This current of thought has increased the number of supporters given the increase of world population and the limited character of natural resources. So this vision is based on 3 models that seek to study the development of collective action. First, the tragedy of the commons studies the forcible degradation of the environment where several people use a scarce common resource, given the arduous task of excluding users and the characteristics rivalry. The individual is aware of the benefit that he appropriates, but not of the deterioration of the common good due to the excessive use, not of how it affects him. The incentive is to maximize individual benefit, since they perceive that they only bear a small cost of the deterioration of that common good. Mechanisms must be implemented to limit access and use of resources. Consequently, property rights are established, which implies the exclusion of people to whom they are not allowed. Another theory or another option is the prisoner's dilemma, a model that is a fundamental problem in EM theory that shows that two people may not cooperate even if it is against their interests. And in the case of collective action, it's maintained that only the prospect of obtaining benefits will make individuals cooperate on their own initiative. In any other case, only the inclusion of coercion mechanisms or the other circumstances will achieve this. The figure of the free rider discourages the cooperation. Faced with such an idea, the contribution to the common effort will dissipate. So the final result will be reached in which the common good will not be provided. As we have seen, these three models lead to a suboptimal result whereby the institution process is believed to be inexorable. Therefore, solutions for cooperation must be sought. At this point, there are two main options for cooperation. Leviathan, or the case of central governments that take charge of resource management. Privatization, allocation of a set of private rights, although it entails cost of monitoring and enforcement of rights. However, both extremes do not occur in reality, nor are they applicable to all cases, and their restrictions are too strict. On the other hand, Armstrong received the Nobel Prize, among other things, for showing that the standard theory of property is very simplistic because it forgets that the users can, by themselves, create and enforce rules that mitigate the overexploitation of natural resources. According to the above, certain resource factors are relevant to reach the most suitable solution for its management. First, number of users. If there is one user, there is no free riding problem. If there are two users, the agreement is very likely. But as the number of the users increases, free riding increases, and the probability that individuals will fall into the prisoner's dilemma is greater. In this case, leadership is a relevant variable to solve this problem. The second factor is corporate governance. When the community is very small and there are many small communities, the national government is usually not a solution, mainly because it would mean excessive bureaucratic expense and because its distance prevents obtaining the information necessary for an optimal solution, as indicated by Aldrich in 2010. In the event that property rights are perfectly defined and assigned, not externalities will occur since the net and social benefits are equal. However, this is not what happens in reality. Okay, so externalities will indeed be a problem to be solved. One solution could be for the community to impose its own rules of use, solution of the tragedy of the commons. But this is not usual, since defining the institutional framework is usually more expensive than the losses generated by the problem of the commons. In consequence, attention must focus on the appropriate choice of institutions, not put the emphasis on government instruments and interventions or total permits, but on the different ways in which people can reach agreements. The establishment of a governance structure. According to what was established by Frey in 2010, to implement adequate institutions, three conditions must be met. First, understanding of how institutions affect the behavior of the individuals involved. Second, new institutional forms have to be taken into account. And in third, the constitutional framework must allow institution closest to home to cope with the problems of free right. So Armstrong argues that in many cases it's much more effective to rely on people to come up with the right rules than on experts who stand at a distance trying to implement a rational solution to social problems. And in addition, sometimes, as Bert pointed out in 2010, these experts do not take into account the customs and incentives already implanted in the community. In conclusion, by implementing management models based on rules and the participation of its members, communities can find ways to avoid the tragedy of the commons. So this successful communal management of natural resources will depend on 10 main variables. First, the size of resource systems, because very large territories prevent good self-organizations, and territories that are too small will not generate enough profit to justify spending transaction costs. In general terms, the favorable situation for self-organization occurs when it comes to medium-sized territories or spaces where productivity can be promoted. The second variable is productivity of the resource system. To require the self-organization, it's often necessary that the scarcity of the resource be felt. So if the resources are very abundant or imperishable, it would be more difficult to change habits. The third variable is about predictability of the dynamics of the resource system. So the system must be predictable so that users feel comfortable and safe in it. Being able to know what is going to happen when implementing certain specific rules. When there is unpredictability in the system on a small scale, users can regroup systems to organize on a larger scales and increase this predictability. Mobile resource units is another important variable. In systems with mobile resource units, self-organization is more difficult since the cost of managing and monitoring these resources are high. So these systems are more expensive than those containing physical units. About the number of users, the size of the group is always relevant. When we have a large number of users, transaction costs increase, since it's difficult to organize and agree on change. But it has the advantage that their number enables the mobilization of labor and the necessary resources. Leadership is very important too. So self-organization is more likely in systems where users with leadership skills are found. They will be used to organize, involve, and give confidence to the other members. So leaders can be loved once within the community and other people empowered by their knowledge. In both cases, they have to have charisma and trust with unity. Norms and social norms or rules or that we understand as social capital is very important too. There will be fewer transactions cost to reach agreements in communities that share the same moral and ethical rules, since a climate of mutual trust is created. Knowledge of the social ecological systems is very important at the same time. Knowledge by users of the characteristics of this kind of systems, their internal rules and the interaction of their actions will favor the assessment of it, and they will perceive all expenses as less than the organization generates. The ninth variable is the importance of the resources for users. In case where self-organization is successful, users value their resources according to two scales: when the resources are a means of subsistence, or when they place a high value on sustainability. And the last, but not the less important variable, are the collective rules of choice. So first, fostering autonomy in the user group to develop and enforce the rules will help to reduce the transaction costs. And I hope that this intervention has been of interest to you. At the same time, that I wish you all the best moments of happiness and above all safety. I am at your disposal at chat, as the moderator said before, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, dear Professor, for your report. Yes, the questions are in the chat or comments. So please, you can contact the speaker. And now I'm announcing the next speaker. As far as I can see, Tomasz Radochonsky is not in the chat, if I'm not mistaken. Right, so we are moving to our speakers, our partners from Romania, in particular from Petroleum Gas University of Ploiești and School of Advanced Studies of the Romania Academy. The topic energy security for well-being in everyday life, the case of Romania, that is the result of the cooperation of three authors who are Diana Joița, Ellen Dinica, and Adrian Neasha. Sorry if I made definitely some mistakes in pronunciation. And as far as I understand, Diana Joița will present this work in co-authorship.
Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you for showing us that happiness means so much, doing usual normal things as participating to a conference and meeting all of you today. I would like to share the presentation. Okay. Can you see the,
yes.
Okay. So our theme is about energy security for well-being in everyday life, and we present some aspects from the Romanian perspective. As far as we know, people are concerned about green transition as a solution to energy poverty. And Romania is also committed to achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement and the 2030 Agenda. The European Pillar of Social Rights states energy as a right for people between all the essential services which are accessible to all. The price accessibility of energy becomes, though, a strategic responsibility for preserving well-being in everyday life, because in many countries, the energy poverty affects the level of social security. At the European level, there was a study, a survey called Europeans' Attitude on EU Energy Policy, which focused on some questions about climate and energy policies and people's wishes for future European actions. As far as Romanians are concerned, the study revealed that for energy priorities, Romanians say that EU must ensure access to affordable energy. So this is something priority for most of our people, so that everybody be able to pay the bills, and also to increase cooperation between member states for also for security, financial, affordable, and clean energy. Well, also Romanians believe that access to secure energy means a well-connected energy network across Europe, and they wish to have more cooperation in cybersecurity in the field of energy. If we talk about the perspective over the next 10 years, also Romanians believe that the European Union should ensure energy costs as low as possible and should invest in develop clean energy technologies. In well, in the past years, the European Union has established some obligations for member states in order to submit some integrated national plans for energy and climate changes for the next decade. So in 2018, Romania has developed a national integrated plan for energy and climate change with a perspective to 2030. And this national plan was the basis for Romania's energy strategy 2020-2030 with a view to 2015. For our study for energy, for well-being, the relevant indicators in the national plan are the percentage of arrears on utility bills and the impossibility of heating the household at a satisfactory level. So if we talk about these two very important indicators for the well-being of Romanians, well, the latest studies show that almost 15% of household in Romania had arrears of utility bills, compared to the average of almost 7% in the European Union. As for the impossibility of heating the households to a satisfactory level in 2020, 10% of households in Romania were in the situation to not pay the bills at the time. And the average was 8% estimated at the European Union. For the next years, Romania is established as a target to regulate the vulnerable consumer, as well as finance measures to in order to protect these difficult situations for people. So the implementation of the National Action Plan on Energy Poverty also sets out critical situation and customers who cannot be disconnected in such situations. And also the modalities in how the operators recover the costs. Well, the regulation for the supply of energy to final consumers in Romania sets set obligations for electricity suppliers as far as concerning to persons in difficult situation, such as priority in the supply of electricity, limitation of planned interruptions, disconnection from the electricity grid, which is prohibited, including in situations of power crisis. Another important element in this national plan in Romania is to ensure a fair transition from the perspective of social and economic impact. Because we have in Romania also mono-industrial profile regions, and the most important of it is Jiu Valley, which depends almost entirely on the coal industry. And this region was included in the platform of the European Commission for Carboniferous Regions in Transition. But before all those aspects, I must say that according to domestic law, Romania has been granting aid for home heating since 2011. But what we have to do next is develop a national IT system of social assistance. Also, since 2012, the electricity and natural gas law creates the premises for a solidarity fund in Romania in order to support the vulnerable consumers. Well, so the Romanian energy strategy with a view to 2050 sets as a strategic responsibility the price accessibility for people. And one of the main challenges of the energy system is this aspect. Also, the energy plan says that we must focus on energy efficiency, but as a top priority, we must take care of protection of vulnerable consumers. Speaking of that, in Romania, the total energy subsidies in 2019 was approximately 1% of the GDP, comparing to the average of 1.3 GDP in EU at the same year. Well, because I didn't want to talk too much, I must go to conclusions. And I will say that the energy sector has a special importance in Romanians' everyday life, and I think in many countries' life. And the challenge is to adapt the energy sector to the new development trends, but taking into account the well-being needs of the citizens. It is still necessary for Romania to close the gap with the EU average, although our country has made progresses in combating energy poverty. So the accessibility of the energy price is a crucial factor for preserving well-being in most people's lives. Policies and measures for the next years in Romania target though the regulation of the vulnerable consumer, as well as finance measures. Thank you all, and we are glad to see you today here.
Thank you very much for an interesting report. And please, dear colleagues, if you have any questions and comments, please write them in the chat, and our speakers will answer your questions and comments after the conference, and you will be able to keep in touch, in particular via email. We have the comment: thanks for the interesting message, very detailed and informative, from Professor Natalia Boychenko. And we move to our next speaker. Actually, that is the lecture, video lecture that was sent in advance by our partner, I can say, for a few years, participant of our conference, who supports us with his participation for a few years already. That is John Arden, a PhD in psychology. He works in the realm of neuropsychology as well, the author of 15 books. Dr. Arden has over 40 years of experience providing psychological services and directing mental health programs, in particular in Northern California, Kaiser Permanente Medical Centers. International speaker, from the United States of America.
Hi, I'm John Arden, and I'm very, very happy and honored to be part of this conference on happiness. And what I'm going to be talking about is how we can divert our attention and unfortunately undermine the capacity to kindle and cultivate a sense of happiness and life satisfaction. Okay, so what we're going to talk about is how some people look for happiness in the wrong places and then develop some addictions, thinking that the feeling good that they get momentarily actually results in an addiction that makes them actually feel bad. So in other words, their quest to become happier results in them becoming more depressive and more anxious. So in the Western world, we have unfortunately developed a craving for bigger, better, more, and as a result of those let's say, ostentatious and gluttonous hunger to accumulate things, we've actually undermined our ability to experience any kind of pleasure. In other words, we become habituated. After a while, getting so much and getting it without any effort results in a dulling that we could say is habituation. And then after a while, that same experience that initially resulted in a brief feeling of pleasure becomes dull and then becomes nauseous, becomes something that we actually don't even like. So we started with a brief good feeling, but really not so good, kind of a numbing out feeling. And then we got dulled to it, and then it starts to feel bad. And there are many neurophysiological explanations for this that I'll get into. As a result of this hunger for quick relief by these feeling better and more and everything else, we then become hyper-focused on some unpleasant feelings like pain, for example, or stress, or rigidity. And as a result of that, we then look for relief. So in other words, there's a progression towards discomfort and depression as a result of us looking for happiness in these brief little gluttonous experiences. And that results in some addictions. So many people in the Western world, especially the United States, developed a overeating habit. And so the United States, for example, we lead the world in obesity right now. And throughout the world, certainly throughout areas that have been experiencing a lot of trauma. Substance abuse is another way that people look to sort of medicate themselves from feeling bad to feel good, but they don't actually feel good. And then gambling, especially during this COVID period. For the last 2 years, the increase in online gambling has shot up astronomically, as well as being addicted to spending hours and hours and hours on the web, perhaps doing video games and so on, and doing online shopping and all that. So all of these efforts, we could say, to feel better, which result in addiction, actually make us feel worse. But the initial effort was to feel better, and that feel better quality relates to some networks that are very common among the pleasure centers in the brain. So in other words, what I'm suggesting here is there are many common factors between the feeling good and the addiction and the feeling bad. And they're connected to motivation in many ways, because from an evolutionary perspective, these networks in the brain, in the body, in our ability to create thoughts were and have been very important with regard to our seeking out and doing things that are actually productive. So if we don't have these motivational networks, our species wouldn't be around. We wouldn't go hunt food. We wouldn't go gathering and so on, or have families and everything. However, unfortunately, our quest to be happy, quote, by doing these brief experiences result in this co-opting of our motivational networks and resulting in displeasure. So some basics. Maybe for about 50 years or so, we've been quite aware of the reward pathways in the brain. And so just briefly, not to get, excuse me, too caught up in the technical terminology, but many different neurotransmitters in the brain drive this. One of the principal ones that are involved in the motivational network includes dopamine. And dopamine is released by a couple areas of the brain, one called the ventrotegmental area, another one called the substantia nigra. Kind of technical terms that you could forget. But the bottom line is, when dopamine is released from this VTA area, ventrotegmental area, and hits one of the main pleasure centers of the brain, another terrible name called the nucleus accumbens, we get this feeling of pleasure. And then the prefrontal cortex, which is the more advanced part of the brain, comes up with a rationalization as to why that was a good thing. And so if you're searching for pleasure, brief pleasures that are part of this neurophysiology, you're going to come up with some rationalizations as to why that was a good thing. And that's what a lot of people do when they're develop various addictions, whether it be gambling, alcohol, marijuana, shopping, whatever. You get this big burst of anticipation, and then you think that what's going to result from your behavior is going to be a good thing. For example, even before you drink, you know it's approaching 5 o'clock at night, you're going to get a release of dopamine from your ventrotegmental area that hits your nucleus accumbens, and you go, oh great, it's almost 5 o'clock, I can get to sit down with this nice glass of wine, and finally I could feel good and be happy. Well, is that really happiness, or is that just a brief feeling of feeling good that unfortunately becomes feeling bad? That's what we want to talk about. And so we have a variety of more advanced parts of the brain that evolved throughout our evolutionary history. And one of the most recent and the last to develop in terms of as a child and adolescent grows up is this top to the side section with the complicated name of dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. All that means is top to the side, lateral meaning side. And it's this area that gives us the capacity to sustain attention and do these executive control, let's say, psychological processes. And so this capacity has been referred to as executive monitoring, and certainly very involved in a lot of the research related to mindfulness and so on. But we psychologists have long talked about what we refer to as working memory. Well, if you are a person that looks for happiness in brief sort of little chunks here and there, your working memory and your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is going to get adapted, or let's say maladapted, to this counterfeit experience of happiness. What I mean by counterfeit is really it's fool's gold. It's not real happiness. It's just a brief experience of pleasure that really becomes displeasure after time. So we monitor a lot of what we do by these states of mind. And sometimes when you look for happiness in the wrong places, the monitoring through the executive network, it shrinks, and the other areas that we call the mind that are functional in the default mode network and the salience network become more expanded. And so what we want to do to retain this capacity to have life satisfaction or happiness is to keep these areas in balance. But what unfortunately happens is we have less activity going on in this harder to activate area of the brain, which is part of this executive network. And we use it to hunt down these brief experiences instead of having a more balanced and not as extreme drive for gratification. So that results in more activity in the salience network's capacity to just feel relaxed. And we assume that just feeling relaxed, that must be happiness. And many people that become addicted to various drugs would spend more time searching out drugs like the opiates. And we have a major epidemic in the United States, especially in the opiate area, as well as the benzodiazepines, which I call the garbage of the healthcare system, the Valiums, the Xanaxes, and so on. And that results in what? Feeling happy? No, not necessarily. Again, we distort our understanding of what satisfaction is all about. Now it becomes relief, but it's really not even relief anymore. Or you might expand your capacity to stay focused and energized, but you really have almost an attention deficit disorder if you gravitate towards being too focused on, let's say, the stimulants, whether it be methamphetamines or even coffee or whatever, and you're just buzzing around and you can't really stay focused in any sustained sort of way. Or you could spend a lot of time fantasizing and being in another world instead of the world right in front of you. And those people that get addicted to drugs that expand that capacity are the marijuanas and the hashishes and the hallucinogens and so on. So what we want to do is to work on balancing these mental operating networks so we can sustain a feeling of life satisfaction that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. But we want to understand how we can help people not get caught up looking for happiness in the wrong places, because they do experience a brief feeling of relief or even a sense of pleasure that they then keep on looking for, and it results in the feeling and the thought that that kind of quest makes a lot of sense. In other words, I'm going to look for happiness by that feeling state or that psychological state. And that means then that the reward hub that I was talking about earlier seems to be the driving force here. And it's no longer a reward in a long-term life satisfaction way, but brief bursts, like I was talking about before, our drive for these extremes. And so we need to get these areas of our psychological capacities to work together. We don't want to lose the capacity for life satisfaction and reward. Well, of course, we want to put it in perspective so it can be more sustained over a period of time. And that means we've got a whole bunch of different neurotransmitters that work here that involve all these various networks that give us the capacity. I'm not reducing everything to this, of course, but give us the capacity for more a wide spectrum feelings of life satisfaction, which include many different neurotransmitters and networks and all that. And then again, we don't want to be reductionistic, but the brain gives us the capacity for thought and also life satisfaction. So let's talk a little bit about dopamine. I don't mean that it is the only neurochemical and we want to reduce everything to dopamine. However, it's the area that gets hijacked. It's the network that gets hijacked, as I was talking about earlier. And it's not necessarily the neurotransmitter of happiness, it's the anticipation of pleasure. And that's what we see in a lot of these addictive patterns. And one of the problems with these extreme feelings of happiness that we sometimes, especially in the Western world, are striving for, is that when we strive for those extremes and have them, whether they be drug-induced or just whatever kind of addiction pattern we might have, the dopamine receptors in the brain actually don't have time to recycle. So actually having big bursts of euphoria results in dysphoria, because the dopamine network in the brain doesn't have time to recycle. So actually, to be able to sustain happiness is part of a moderate level of activation. In other words, small pleasures give us the capacity to have sustained pleasures we could call happiness or life satisfaction. Extreme pleasures, euphoric experiences, actually give us a roller coaster kind of experience. So that tells us a lot about the capacity for happiness by looking at these addiction patterns, in that happiness isn't extreme pleasure, but rather it's a subtle appreciation for the multiple textures in life. And in fact, what we know from this perspective is that rehabilitation for these addictions necessitates us helping people learn how to have subtle pleasures. And this is what happens with the dopamine circuit and how we kind of, unfortunately, fall into an addictive pattern. We could be riding along and all of a sudden, whoa, geez, I didn't realize that glass of wine, this isn't wine, but that, wow, that gave me a really great, I'm going to do that again. And unfortunately, we do it again, the second line there, but it doesn't result in anything that great. So we go, wait a minute, I'm going to do that again. And so you see the bump on the left side, it results in a not so high bump in the third line, but it is a bump. Hey, I'm going to do that again. Maybe I can get a bigger bump the next time. Well, actually, you get an effort, anticipation, but you don't get the reward. And that's where addictions happen. So people that are addicted to alcohol, gambling, whatever it might be, actually end up feeling bad because they habituate. In other words, these circuits start to go down. So here their quest for being happiness not only results in dull feelings, but displeasure. And we know that from all sorts of brain imaging studies, and this is related to gambling and how when you're expecting a big win, for example, whether or not you're at a casino or you're online, increasingly that's where we are now, that we could see these dopamine networks just flood the brain with that, and you expect a big win, but uh-oh, I don't get a big win. That means you get a big crash. So in other words, we're creating mood disorders in many ways by these looking for pleasure or happiness in the wrong places. And so there's a big difference between wanting and liking. And again, I'm not trying to reduce everything to this picture, but these two neurotransmitter systems, the dopamine network and the endogenous opiate network, are really a bit different. And in fact, the dopamine network, there's a bunch of different networks within the dopamine network, but wanting is the anticipation of pleasure, looking for it, like the rush I was showing you in the previous slide. And liking is more related to the endogenous opiate network. So wanting and liking, especially when you're addicted, get split off. You keep on wanting, but eventually you don't like what you want, but you just can't work it out as much. And that's what we see with all these addictive patterns. Now, dopamine itself has a whole bunch of different networks, the D1, D2, D3, D4, different receptors in the brain. But I'm going to try to simplify this to make it more understandable. The dopamine D1 receptors are more related to the basal ganglia area of the brain, which are these automatic habitual responses. And that's sort of like a mindless habit that we might have. And the D2 receptors are the ones that we want to expand because when they do expand, they become multiple. These are also referred to as medium spiny neurons that give us the capacity to appreciate the subtleties around us, like walking on a trail and enjoying the sun on our back and the different colors that we can see throughout the day as the sun kind of goes through its cycle and everything else. With the D1 receptors is I got to get home, I want to get a drink. That's the only time I feel good. Well, you really don't, but still you're chasing that. The D2 receptors are the ones that give us the capacity to, wow, that's really a nice sunset out there, or pre-sunset and so on, and we're experiencing all these subtleties. So to be able to experience these pleasures, we need lifestyle practices. And these lifestyle practices have been long researched, and I just happen to put them in a mnemonic called SEEDS so that we can boil them all down to basic, let's say, self-care behaviors. And the SEEDS, mnemonic, social, exercise, education, diet, and sleep, are the 5 healthy factors that you need to practice on a regular, daily basis. And in fact, some colleagues of mine and I developed a SEEDS app that I can send to you. If you send me an email, and I'll send you the link, it's free on the App Store, because what we want to do is be accountable. Everybody can agree that these SEEDS factors are critical. They give you the foundation for happiness. If you don't do these on a regular basis, you can't grow these subtle appreciations. So at the end, you can check out my email address, email me, and I'll send you the link. But these SEEDS factors have multiple feedback loops that support them, that are related to your metabolism, related to your gene expression, relates to how your immune system gets activated and deactivated, and certainly your habit motivational systems that give you the capacity to look at the world with a sense of pleasure, life satisfaction. And there are multiple networks. So the habit networks in the brain aren't just the ventrotegmental area and the nucleus accumbens, and then your prefrontal cortex comes up with these reasons and all that, but there are multiple other networks that give you that capacity. So we also want to keep in perspective that leaning towards a life is very important in terms of being able to sustain positive feelings. So we know that the 2 hemispheres of the brain have different behavioral capacities. The right hemisphere is more associated to withdrawal and avoidance, the left hemisphere to engagement and approach behaviors. And it turns out that overactivity of the right hemisphere is associated with depression and anxiety, which is interesting because avoidance and withdrawal makes anxiety and depression worse. Well, engagement actually helps you feel better, but you don't feel like doing it, but you've got to do what you don't feel like doing to feel better. So happiness in many ways is dependent upon life engagement. You can't just sit there and wait to feel happy. And we know that from a lot of research that relates to these contemplative practices, which include mindfulness and so on, that this, we could call it affect asymmetry, the difference in the capacities of the 2 hemispheres that need to be balanced, are activated if you engage in these looking for engagement with others and connectivity with others. So if you're practicing contemplative, compassionate mindfulness, for example, there's more neuroplasticity in the left prefrontal cortex than the right. Interesting. In other words, you're leaning towards life. And you could also say this really has a tremendous relevance to the capacity for life satisfaction. It's engagement in life. It's engagement with others that we could say has the foundation, the SEEDS foundation that I was talking about earlier. So across studies, we could say that to sustain happiness with the foundation of the seeds factors and not getting caught up looking for pleasure in the wrong places, is greater than just the absence of disease. It's really a sense of well-being, and it's a well-being in a communal, connective way. So it's a state that you're able to sustain over a period of time without these extremes. And we've also got to understand the wisdom that has been discussed in philosophy for a couple thousand years, way back, maybe 2,400 years ago, with Chuang Tzu, who recognized that happiness is really not something that you hold on to, because as you look for happiness constantly, you're going to get stuck in one of these addictive patterns. And so he suggested that happiness is the absence of looking for it so much. And of course, Daniel Gilbert wrote a really popular book called Stumbling on Happiness. I mean, these are brief experiences that you could call happiness, and the ability to string them together with a sense of pleasure, we could say, is sustained life satisfaction. And that requires those dopamine receptors we're talking about, the savoring of sensation through your capacity for working memory. Remember, I was talking about the executive network, and a non-judgmental perspective. In other words, you're not always saying, oh, that's good, that's bad. No, things are much more complex than that. And you notice the subtleties. And that means you need those mental operating networks to be working together. I like this saying from Zen Buddhism, because it relates to that difference in the two hemispheres and so on. So Zen is not like chopping wood, Zen is chopping wood. In other words, being active and engaged instead of sitting back and waiting for things to happen to you is part of the neurophysiology of supporting those seeds elements that give you the capacity for, quote, happiness. So in general, we can all agree that pleasure is fleeting, but we need to stay engaged. We need to develop positive habits to make these fleeting moments happen on a more regular basis. And unfortunately, in more urban environments, we have less a capacity to be around in nature. So fortunately, some urban environments, many urban environments have parks, some have bigger parks. It's capacity and it's the experience of being in contact with nature that can help give you a wider spectrum. And be able to actually see some pleasure in a desert of displeasure. In other words, when things aren't going so well, do you have the capacity to see some positive outcome there? I'm not saying put on rosy glasses and deny the bad things. I'm saying look forward so positive things can happen. And finally, in the area of positive psychology, which is really an outgrowth of what used to be called humanistic psychology, in other words, there's science to these concepts. We know that this idea of acceptance is really important. Many therapeutic practices factor this in. In other words, just accept where you are and build from there. And then this concept of forgiveness. In other words, many of us have different not so good things happen to us. And many of those things that happen to us are the result of somebody doing something against us. The result of this research on forgiveness doesn't necessarily say, give the person a free ticket, that's okay, you hurt me. No, you forgive them within yourself. In other words, you still hold them accountable, but you forgive them within yourself. In other words, you're letting go, and instead of replaying over and over again the bad things that they did to you. Also, there's a huge amount of research related to both gratitude and compassion. And it's it turns out that those two factors are so incredibly powerful. If you can wake up every morning and just feel a sense of gratitude about something, maybe you're just alive and you're healthy, that's enough. Or you live in a nice place, or you have, good family relationships. Just having a sense of gratitude and playing that over and over again gives you a sense of lift and the ability that we have to express and feel compassion for one another is an antidepressant, but it's also a life satisfaction experience. So in other words, if you're able to express compassion, you can actually feel compassion towards yourself. So there's these areas of the brain that are very strongly associated with these capacities, like the anterior cingulate and others, that grow with neuroplasticity as a result of you doing good things. So those of us that have been very fortunate to be in the helping professions, in healthcare, for example, boy, I've been lucky because I've been able to do that for a living. And so that's been a helpful thing for me over a period of time. But you don't need to be in the helping profession. Just be compassionate and connected with others. It is part of this psychological perspective that gives you the capacity for life satisfaction and happiness. Finally, just to bring up this idea that there's no one thing called the mind, and what you rehearse in your mind has a lot to do with your capacity to have life satisfaction and happiness. We're going through these networks constantly. There's no one thing called the mind. And so those researchers that are exploring mindfulness and different types of meditation and all that are centering their attention on these different areas of the brain that we can then harness and cultivate so that we can have these subtle levels of appreciation that have more staying power to give us life satisfaction. So the references for my talk, especially the book in the middle, are these right here. And I mentioned earlier, I was going to give my email address, which is on the top, my website on the bottom. So if you want a link to the app, or you could just go to the App Store, remember it's free, and just type in seeds factors. So you can get a lot of different hits for seeds, SEEDS, but seeds factor, and you can download the app for free. And my website is below. Okay, well, thank you for attending online, and very much appreciate and honored to be part of this conference.
And we have a question here from Professor Natalia Boychenko, and I will just say a few words to clarify the situation that actually I met with Dr. Arden to record this lecture before the war. It was on the 15th of February that we met with Dr. Arden. So unfortunately, in this lecture, he didn't include any comments, any advices, because there was 9 days before. However, I would like to add that Professor Boychenko asks if at the biochemical level, happiness correlates with the levels of serotonin, oxytocin, endorphins, dopamine, then how to ensure a sufficient level of these hormones to our citizens during the war and therefore constant stress. So actually I'm a philosopher, but I'm I know the theory very good as the co-author of the book on happiness. We can increase the level of hormones by different daily activities that we used to do before the war, but just we can a bit adapt to the new reality. For example, dopamine needs planning. You plan an event, you're waiting for an event, and you increase your dopamine. So if, for example, you were planning to go abroad for vacations, now you have no such opportunity, but you can at least plan to get back home in the evening and have a dinner with your family. So that is a smaller plan, but much more precious under the circumstances of war and crisis and stress. Or, for example, oxytocin, just very simple recipe, more hugs, hugging people. That is actually the recipe that is very simple to use. So social connection, even volunteering, right? That is also the activity that increases hormones of happiness, because we feel belonging, we feel connection with people, and we feel that we help someone. That is how actually we can increase our happiness at biological level. If there are any, I've shared Dr. Arden's website and email, and we are very grateful to him about this lecture. And we move to our next speaker, and that will be the interview with Dr. Dan Hybron. Those who joined us from the very beginning of the conference, you've heard already the greetings from Dr. Hybron, and I will just mention that and remind that Dr. Dan Hybron is a PhD associate professor of the Department of Philosophy at St. Louis University, St. Louis, Missouri, United States of America. And we move to the greetings were at the very beginning, and now we move to the interview.
Hello, and I will not attempt to butcher your language, but thank you for having me. And it's an honor to be part of a Ukrainian event at this time. And I think it's amazing that and it's just yet another sign of the resilience of the Ukrainian people that you're putting on a happiness conference at this time, which might surprise a lot of people, but I think makes a lot of sense. And I just want you all to know that if nothing else, this is unified people over on my side of the Atlantic, and we're just all horrified by this invasion, and inspired though also by your bravery and resourcefulness in resisting it. And we are really rooting for you, and you know, I hope we give you the help that you need. And I wish you very much, wish you the best of luck.
Thank you very much, Dan. We are extremely glad to have this support from you, and we are very happy that for the fourth time you already have been joining our conference. And in these extremely challenging times, it is also very important to feel this support and have this communication. And well, these sunflowers are extremely symbolic for us, very warm today. So thank you again. I would like to ask you about your current research you are working on, and actually two studies, probably they are related. I would like to ask you about your article with a psychologist colleague on measuring happiness, and about your book. Are they related, these two studies, somehow, or these are different directions?
They're not directly related. They came, but they're different parts of my interest in happiness and the good life. But there's connections, but they really, so this new happiness measure of, we're framing it as a measure of emotional well-being. That came out of a project I led with the Templeton Foundation, where especially after working with policymakers and thinking about using well-being measures in policy, for instance, in Bhutan, I could see that there were real deficiencies. There were some things missing in the measures that were out there of happiness. The word happiness has so many meanings, even in English. I mean, who knows what happens between Ukrainian and English? ЩАСТЯ, I think, might be a Ukrainian. I mean, I'm sure I'm saying it wrong.
No,
but,
that is very close. ЩАСТЯ, exactly. Okay. It's correct.
And happiness in English sometimes means what that probably means in Ukrainian is something like what you wish to people on their wedding day, or for a newborn, or a life of happiness, of good fortune, of doing well, flourishing and thriving. And that's really why I care about happiness in my sense of the word. In my sense of the word, it's just one part of well-being or flourishing, but it's a really important part. And you can think of happiness in my sense as roughly the opposite of anxiety, depression, and stress. And one of the horrible things about war is that it creates an immense amount of suffering, and a great deal of that is emotional. Just the other night, I saw an interview with a woman in Kyiv who was getting medicine for people. And the only medicine they mentioned that she was giving was and I'm sure there was lots of different kinds of medicine, but it was anti-anxiety. And people were really grateful for that. And I would probably need a lot of that if I had people dropping bombs on me. So happiness is important, and I tend to be more interested on the unhappiness side, on reducing that suffering. And part of the idea of this measure is to bring together mental health research. I think unhappiness is a very healthy response to many circumstances. In wartime, it isn't always appropriate even to be happy, although it can be surprising, where one can find a laugh, or but at the same time, people tend to treat mental health issue. Well, they call forms of unhappiness like depression and anxiety mental health problems, and I don't care what we label them, but that's been well studied. But completely different measures, completely different ways of approaching it. A greater awareness that people don't necessarily know how they feel very well. And so that's been separated from in positive psychology research under the label of happiness. So we tried to bring those two paradigms together, the kind of positive psychology and negative psychology. And we also wanted to have a scale for measuring that would allow different cultures to focus, put more weight on different forms of happiness or unhappiness, depending on what they value. So in East Asia, people value peace of mind or tranquility or serenity more. So that's one. So we've broken it down into 6 different subdimensions of happiness and unhappiness. So roughly, cheerfulness, energy, being energetic, and serenity or peace of mind. And on the negative side, sadness, lethargy, like with depression, and anxiety or stress. And most scales just lump all that together. And I think it's important to break that out because, in Americans, we're really into the cheerfulness thing, the smiley face. But not everybody values that as much. And I personally think peace of mind, again, I think it's most important to get so that you're in a position to be able to enjoy life and function in life. And so this measure, so we've developed that and it just got published in the Journal of Positive Psychology in a special issue honoring Marty Seligman, who is one of the founders of positive psychology. And yeah, so we're very excited about that. And this is going to need more validation. It appears to work pretty well. And we're excited that we were able to get this complicated measure out there. It's just got 18 items, and we're hoping to come up with simpler versions, but also to translate it. And this might be a place where you or colleagues in Ukraine, before long, we're going to be looking for collaborators in different countries to try seeing whether the measure works in different cultures as we hope it will. And that will be, we're just getting started, but I'm kind of excited about it. And I'm hopeful. And one of the things we found, incidentally, is that the unhappiness factors, sadness, anxiety, and lethargy, or stress and lethargy, got almost identical results to standard depression and anxiety scales. So you could use this happiness measure. Essentially, in principle, it may work as a screening tool for things like anxiety and depression. It's not designed exactly for that purpose, but so that and maybe talking about that a little bit sort of illustrates the way I think about happiness. Also, thinking about how you measure it, and we know that measuring is a little bit crude. You're always going to miss. Poets know there's a lot you can't boil down into numbers, but it's better. What we've been doing so far, and maybe part of how we got into this mess currently politically, is our governments have focused on counting money, just piling up money, making more money, consuming, and we're only recently starting to look and see whether that actually pays off in terms of human quality of life.
Thank you. And what about your book? What is the date of release, of the publication?
I owe it to the publisher in July, and I, that was an aspirational deadline. So the answer is I don't know. I hope next year. I'm still the manuscript. I have a couple of chapters drafted and posted on my website, and this spring I'm really hoping to be able to add drafts of all the chapters to my website, so anybody who wants to can look at it and tell me what I got wrong, or help me to improve it. But so I'm not sure when the book will come out, but it's called The Lives We Should Want. And it's a book really broadly about the good life. And to me, that's a much wider notion than happiness or well-being. And it's kind of, I'm in a strange position where I feel like I'm doing something that it shouldn't need to be done, but as far as I can tell, it hasn't been done before. And that's clearly distinguishing, and I don't know how this works in your language, but in English, and at least where I live, we often use the word good life just as the broadest thing that includes the moral life. It includes happiness. It includes whatever it is that matters in life. And the average person doesn't. So the other day, our 90-year-old lady, our neighbor, passed away. And it was a sad occasion, but it was not tragic because she was 90 and she had a good life. And when you look back on a life and you think, did they have a good life? I don't think you just look, well, was it a happy life? Her life wasn't entirely happy. It ended up going well, but she started out one day, I thought she just was born in St. Louis, and it turned out she had been a little girl. She was Jewish and was a little girl in Vienna when, and one of her earlier memories was being 6 years old and a knock on the door in Vienna, and she saw the shiny black boots of a Nazi officer demanding to know where her father was. They wanted his factory. He owned a fan factory. And Long story short, she and her sister were able to escape and eventually make it through Italy, and then eventually made it to the US after many close calls. As the rabbi at the service noted, she went through exactly what's happening to many Ukrainians right now. So she had a very hard start and lost all of her family except for her sister in the Holocaust. But then she went on and had another more than 80 years of living here in St. Louis, and got a college degree, has 3 children, 8 grandchildren, and 18 great-grandchildren. And anyway, she like 29 descendants that she's left and counting. And she was a cheerful person. She enjoyed life, and that was a good life. And I think all of us could agree that that was a good life despite the hardships. And that's not just saying she enjoyed it. It's not just saying she flourished. I think the most important part of it actually is that she seems to have led it well. Everybody agrees that she was a good person. She was giving, she looked out for others. And that's, so this book is really about trying to make sense of what goes into that, because that's also, maybe it's not so important at the end of life to figure out whether you had a good life. But when thinking about how to live, what kind of lives do we want? And when I started working on happiness, the idea was that our way of life was nuts. I thought this, at least from when I was 10 years old or something, I traveled, I've been to different places and saw that there were sane ways of living and insane ways of living. And the mainstream way of life in the West, at least in the United States, was not, it's not as insane as many things, of course, but just this life of very ecologically destructive and humanly destructive frenzy, overwork, and loneliness that we've kind of created here. I may be overstating it a little bit. We've gained some things too, but I don't think we're getting our money's worth, and the world is not getting its money's worth, so to speak. And there's got to be better ways where we can achieve greater happiness with less impact. And part of that, I think, is getting a sense not just of what it means to be happy, but how happiness fits into the good life more broadly. And I think it's really important. Actually, happiness mattering depends on other things mattering. We get our happiness, as you know, and as you mentioned earlier on, that from having purpose, from doing worthwhile things. And that's the part of the book that I throw in a theory of well-being, where happiness and fulfilling our values are part of the picture, fulfilling our natures. I also think the moral life is absolutely essential. But I leave that to the moral theorists. That's one thing my colleagues have really spent a lot of time on. So I let them deal with that problem. What I'm most interested in is the things other than morality and happiness or well-being that I think matter. And I think there are other values like beauty and excellence that I think animate many of our lives. It's part of why I do what I do for a living. I want to be good at my trade. I don't think of myself as having a career. I don't care about the promotions. I want to do something worthwhile and do it well. And similarly, I'm lucky to have a Ukrainian tailor here who my best suit, I was lucky enough, he had been made by the tailor, and the customer, who happened to be my size, never picked it up. So I got a nice, a suit I couldn't otherwise afford by this absolute, craftsman, an artist. And I do not think that he is motivated by self-interest mainly. I mean, we all care about self-interest. When he's doing his work, I'm making some guesses here, but I've seen so many people like this, and I go to people like him because he's after excellence. He wants to do his job well. He wants to create excellent suits and also beauty. He has he can see all sorts of distinctions in suits. I'm the last person who should have a good suit. I can't tell a good suit from a bad suit. I'm afraid to say that, and I won't tell him that, but yeah, he'll show me. Anyway, so he has a sense of beauty and aesthetic, and that to me is, and again, I think part of happiness is recognizing that things like beauty and excellence matter in themselves and not just because they're good for us. They are good for us, but that's because we benefit from engaging with them. And also part of virtue, part of living well is engaging with them. I want my children to appreciate good music, good food, natural beauty above all. And that's, so another part of in the background of this book is why protect the environment? Why should we care about the loss of biodiversity, for example? It's bad for people. That's the main reason, I think. That's a good enough reason, but I think it's, if we cause a mass extinction, that could take 10 million years for the Earth to recover. That's gonna be the one thing we're all remembered for. And if there's anything left to remember us, and I don't want that to be our legacy. And part of why is that bad? I think a biologically impoverished planet is a less beautiful planet. And my neighbor Liz, who just passed away, she'd been through the Holocaust. She knew the bad stuff in life. She knew it was important. But we have beautiful trees in our backyard that I'm looking at now that are still there because she and other women in the neighborhood went out and put their bodies in front of the bulldozers many years ago to prevent them from cutting them down to build a development. In the United States, developers love nothing better than cutting down trees. And people don't understand how much of a blessing trees are, and that she understood the beauty matters and she protected that. And so there's a philosophical agenda. That's my main audience. I'm writing for philosophers. There's a practical agenda, which is, I think we have kind of a spiritual crisis in our society, civilization. And part of it is this ethic of consumption that I think, that our public ethic, which I don't think actually almost anybody likes, not even economists like it, but it's kind of the ethic that economists operate with, which is all that matters is getting what you want, whatever you happen to want. There's not even any, just getting what you want, and don't hurt other people. But really, the good life is about getting what you want, and okay, yeah, don't hurt other people, maybe help people sometimes. That's sort of our public ethos, and I think that's had a lot to do with kind of creating a society of people that are, I don't think anybody deserves the label consumer. Well, Putin and Trump. Okay, I'll try not to get political, but okay, there are certainly psychopaths can deserve the label, but most people, I think, and maybe I'm optimistic, but I think most people, even in places like Miami, which is not my favorite culturally, though I do like it, people do actually care about beauty and doing things well. And they do care about things other than just getting what they want. But our culture doesn't license that thought. It doesn't give us permission in a way to think that way. And what I'm hoping for is that we start shifting more to a culture of appreciation, an ethic of appreciation, where we appreciate an independently valuable world outside of us. And that's what's really gratifying. That's what brings us happiness. And it's also worth doing for its own sake, that we recognize, we appreciate beauty and excellence. We cultivate virtues like gratitude and awe and wonder, and try to become appreciators. And I think, no ethic, no philosophy is going to stop war completely. So there's just bad people out there, and but it's got to help if, maybe we create fewer of these people who start wars and wreck the environment, if we get beyond this idea of that we're just consumers and really try to cultivate a life as appreciators of what's good in the world. And that's probably far more than anyone wanted to know about the book, but I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. And here is a question that is really very deeply philosophical, and I'm not like you're not supposed to answer it in a very detailed way, but right now we are facing a threat to the whole democratic global community, because indeed Putin's aim is not just to conquer Ukraine, is to threat the democratic order of the world. And the world probably to some extent wasn't very ready for such threat, because there was a quite stable situation for many decades after the Second World War, and there was a feeling of safety anyway, and people were started to aim at well-being, at quality of life, and so on. And now we see that in just 1 minute everything can change, and something must be done to avoid such situation in the future. Do you have any ideas as for now what this new world would look like? What should we do in the future? I mean, in philosophical, definitely we let economy, politics to economists and other researchers, but in philosophical way, what can be done, and what should be the worldview, the ideas in this new world, the foundation?
That's a wonderful question, and that's sometimes you just need to pass the ammunition. But even in times like this, it's really, and especially maybe now when the situation has our attention, to really think about the long view. And that's a wonderful question. I don't know the answer, but I think we have to work these. I think our problems are really interconnected in so many ways. So one of the things I'm working on at the moment is working with colleagues at the moment in biology to build a map of how things look in different parts of St. Louis. And as you know, St. Louis has a problem historically with racism, and we're finding some very interesting results about the way well-being is distributed around St. Louis. My colleagues in biology are studying how biodiversity differs around the city, and also how there's environmental injustice, and how in the summer, it can be 20 degrees hotter in the black parts of St. Louis than in the white parts of St. Louis. It's crazy. And when it's 100 degrees, 40 degrees Celsius, something, you add 20 degrees, that's you can't live like that. So, and then you think the inequality, economic inequality, I think all these problems are connected with each other. And I think international conversations like this are one start, building community. And I feel like one thing that we can do at home is, in the United States, this is very important because we've really lost most of our sense of community, and I think we need to find ways of living in more resilient. And again, I don't know to what extent this applies to Ukraine, but where we can be more resilient in the face of climate threats and other threats if we build smaller, if we build communities in a way that people know each other and can rely on each other. So in my neighborhood, most of us, we just buy whatever. If you need something, we should just be borrowing stuff from each other. And we do that. It's a nice neighborhood by local standards, but we don't all need a log ladder or a chainsaw or all this stuff we duplicate. And if we had economic shocks, and the more we can rely on each other, so when we lose power, share each other's generators and whatnot. I think building community, though, that also spills out the more we have a sense, like our leisure time isn't spent shopping on our own, but actually spending time with friends and cultivating relationships. I think that changes your whole outlook. And I think it helps a sense of community and fellowship with other people helps make us less predatory, less selfish, generally. Maybe in schools, I think teaching kids, getting kids, I think it's wonderful to bring in positive psychology, meditation, things like that into schools. But I think also, I don't think there should be anything controversial about teaching kids to appreciate beauty and to really get every child should have a chance to see the Milky Way. About a third of the humanity has never seen really a starry night. I find that appalling. And so how do we protect nature if we don't do that? Maybe I'll just end this with this answer with one question. There's a wonderful book, which I recommend anybody to read it's a Native American biologist named Robin Wall Kimmerer. It's called Braiding Sweetgrass. And it's just a stunning book. And it's about plants and what they do for us, and that's not that interesting to me. I mean, I like all things science, but it's what it's really about is our relationship with nature. And she's wanting to cultivate a culture of gratitude. So very similar to things I'm talking about. And she gives the example of with the Haudenosaunee, I'm probably mispronouncing it, Iroquois Confederacy in upstate, in New York State. At every meeting, every social function or political function, they start by going around the room and reciting a Thanksgiving prayer. And each person recites thanks to the earth, thanks to the fish, thanks to the birds, thanks to the stars. And it can go on for 10 minutes or it can go on for hours. Normally not that long, but, and at the end, after each person says one verse, everybody says together, now our minds are one. I don't know what actually happens at the end of their meeting, after that, then when they have the meetings, but I find it hard to believe if our governments did that, if we all did that in school and spent 10 minutes just giving thanks to the gifts that the world has given us. And I'm not religious, but it's a gift in my view. If we did that, I have a hard time believing at then the meeting, resolved, let's start a war, or let's blow up a mountain so we can take its coal, or let's drain the Aral Sea to grow like the Soviet government did. I think we would be a lot less, it's very indirect, and I'm just, this is just my instinct. I don't, and it may be overly optimistic, but I think changing the way we think, and at the same time, though, we have to work on the material side. Like as long as we have the amount of inequality we have in income and wealth, it's going to be hard to get people on the same page. So I'll leave off there.
Okay, thank you again, Dan, for this, for sharing your ideas and for supporting us with your participation for the 4th year already, because 3 times you participated in our conference and 1 more time in the conference we were co-hosting and initiating. So thank you very much for your support, and hope to see you next year as well.
Same here, and it's an honor to be part of this, and I think it's wonderful that you're doing this, and you'll all be in my thoughts, and we'll hopefully do our part to support you, and stay well and give them hell.
Thank you. So we move to the next speaker, and I'm inviting Sergi Rossell, PhD, Associate Professor, Department of Philosophy at University of Valencia, Spain, with the topic on the good life in the face of the totalitarian threat.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me well? Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Well, and we see the presentation as well.
Okay, that's good. I wanted to start saying that it's really an honor for me to be here in this conference. I wanted to express also my support and support from other people from my university to all the people of Ukraine and for all this situation. And I'm gonna start quickly because I have no much time. My presentation will be about some basic conceptual points, philosophical points. I try to sketch like a framework and discuss it a bit, and then I'll go for some consequences related to that idea of the totalitarian threat. I can. Okay. I'll start with what we can call, following Bernard Williams, the Socratic question. This is the question of how should one live. This is a question that Williams thought is the best starting point for moral philosophy, because of how little it presupposes. The important thing is this is not a question specifically about the moral, but it's a broader question about the whole of our life. Williams didn't think that, or he was skeptical that philosophy could help us or could answer this question in the sense of having a theoretical or abstract answer to this question, but the question can, or at least philosophy can help us to understand the very question, and then this is half of our. This is a big advance in a topic to try to understand the question well or better. And in the job of trying to answer this question, I think it's relevant, very interesting to have in mind that the question, or the way we frame our the question can't can skip the multi-texture complexity that life itself involves, as in this comment you can find. Okay. Ancients answer these questions. This question appealing to the idea of eudaimonia, as you know, involving virtue in one way or another. But this is, of course, a broader notion than our modern notion of happiness, in modern philosophy, we had this split between morality and happiness as two dimensions of our life. But my question, or what I want to introduce here or discuss here, is whether these two dimensions are exhaustive of the big or the main dimensions of our life. And there is this idea of having meaning in life as a third distinctive dimension. And the idea would be that a good life would have to include these three dimensions. We need to have in mind that what I mean, or the idea of meaning that I have here, I want to deal with, is not the idea of the meaning of life, which is related to something like whether our life matters from a cosmic perspective or something like that. But more closer to us, the idea is that what things give meaning or do our life more meaningful within our life, not in the sense of looking at human life from an external, a radically external perspective. Of course, both questions are connected, and they have the answer. How we answer one question can have implication for the other. But I will leave this. I will skip this and just concentrate in the idea that there is a particular dimension in our everyday life, or in our life within our perspective, which involves the idea of meaningfulness, or a kind of value which is related to meaningfulness. The philosopher who has advanced this idea, or has done more to introduce this idea, the idea that meaning is like is a third dimension, is Susan Wolf. Wolf thinks that current models of motivation and practical reason leave out important motives and reasons that save our lives. In particular, she thinks that the reasons and motives that are left out are those that engage us in the activities that make our lives worth living. Her argument is that it's related to the kind of reasons or motives that we would appeal to in order to talk about any of these dimensions. She relates happiness to self-interest, morality with impartiality, and then there's like a third dimension that she relates or connects to the idea of reasons of love, reasons that move us to pursue non-personal interest about which we are especially passionate, are not impartial, but are not strictly, or at least are not, this kind of pursuings are not related to self-interest. I'm skeptical about this, that there is a strict connection or conceptual or constitutive link between meaningfulness and reasons of love. I try to put forward the same idea, appealing to what I will call the argument from kind of satisfaction. Let's think of, the idea is that there are different kinds of satisfactions or dissatisfaction that are different, or there's at least one which is different from that coming, or those coming from both happiness and the idea or the satisfaction of acting rightly, which would be related to the idea of the dimension, to the morality dimension. There is here one example. Imagine some parents who devote all their time in their life to take care of their seriously ill child. There's a fundamental sense in which their life is deeply unfortunate. It's not happy in this sense, but they can find the meaning of their life in taking care of their child. This would be this would be let's say that that would imply that there is like a dimension of a kind that that we know about this different satisfaction that we find in an example like this. Of course, some could object that maybe they are doing this not from a sense of or from the satisfaction which is proper to happiness, but to morality. This is related more to morality than to happiness, and then we would have this. We wouldn't have this third dimension. But I think this is not necessarily so, and at least and moreover, it is quite strange to describe for me this situation like this. It seems that the motivation here is more related to the idea of love or a relationship. However, not always this third dimension, it seems to me, could be described in terms of reasons of love exactly. Let's think of this different example in which an artist, a frustrated artist, let's say, has a vocation that gives her a sense of value with she relates to the idea of meaning, even though she doesn't achieve the expected result. In a sense, this is a frustrated artist, and in this sense, she's unhappy or not as happy as she could be, but this vocation gives her a meaning. This is a kind of passion, but I wouldn't exactly relate or describe this as a reason of love in the sense of or at least not exactly, but this is not my main point. I don't want to object to this idea. I just want to try to present this framework from this argument, which a bit is not exactly it's not Wolff's argument, but I think it's easier to get the impression or to get the idea of these three dimensions, independently of the idea that the third dimension, the meaningful dimension, is strictly or conceptually or constitutively linked to the idea of reasons of love. The idea would be, or the resulting framework if this argument is working, is that we would have three main dimensions which define the idea of a good life in the broader sense. These dimensions would be morality, related to the idea of acting rightly, virtuously; happiness, which is difficult to define in itself, but it would be a particular dimension of in this framework, and then a third dimension that would be related to meaning, to meaningfulness, that would be about pursuing our own passions, projects, etc. I try to characterize a bit more this in a minute. But we have, this framework has some clear difficulties to me. It's not clear that, well, I skipped some difficulty, but the idea is that it's, if we want to defend this framework, we would have to say that even if its dimension is plural in itself, there is like a clear distinction or cut between they that, and in a sense, they don't clearly intertwine, but I'll come back to this. Maybe for some people, the main problem is in the relation between the dimensions of happiness and meaningfulness, which some people would tend to put together as a dimension clearly different to morality. I think that meaning in life has to do specifically with passions, projects, which are particularly important in our life, in one's life. Of course, happiness is also about passions and life projects. I'm not thinking in a very clear or well-defined idea of passions or projects. We can simply think of this in a very loose, in very loose terms. The point to me is the way in which I would distinguish between meaning and happiness, even acknowledging that both are in some sense related to particular passions, projects. I mean, the main distinction is that morality is about impartiality, and these other two dimensions are connected to a kind of partiality, but a different kind. One more about self-interest and the other more about not impartial, but not strictly personal aims or projects. To me, the main difference would be that happiness is more clearly close or linked to the idea of achievement. To be happy, we need that things go well in a particular sense. But meaning is more compatible, or is compatible with or it's not necessary that it's not incompatible with failure, or is compatible with substantial failure. Of course, it needs a minimum of success or progress in order that we can actually pursue that passions or project that matter to us. But it's not strictly connected to the idea of getting what we want, in a sense, in a very loose sense. Of course, this framework has a lot of questions that I'll just present here, and I'll let us open questions. One is if these three distinctive dimensions are really distinctive, and if they all three exhaust the idea of a good life. Okay, this is an important question. Another one is how they should relate, whether hierarchically as a kind of harmony, whatever. I don't go into this. I'm just presenting some alternative. Of course, another important question would be if there is a perfect ideal mix of all these three dimensions. And an important or another one important question would be whether this dimension, even if they are distinctive in an important sense, there is a kind of intertwining between them, in the sense that one can have a meaningful life if that life, for example, is immoral, or that kind of connections. My take on this would be that all combinations are possible, but I'm not gonna argue for this directly. I just want to consider the idea whether lives can be immoral and meaningful at the same time. I know that some people would object that a deeply immoral life cannot be meaningful. This objection could be present like this, like some people would have called this the admirability objections. The idea is that if a meaningful life is an admirable one, for example, let's say Pol Pot or whatever other person we clearly consider immoral in the extreme sense, life cannot be meaningful because it's not admirable at all. My reply would be that a meaningful life is always better than a meaningless one, if everything is the same, ceteris paribus. Inasmuch as one was able to cultivate passions and ground projects to achieve significant accomplishments, etc., their life is more admirable than the same life without those features. Then I think one has reason to be fulfilled, and one life is more meaningful, or is at least in a minimum sense meaningful, as long as it includes some of these features, even if that life is extremely immoral. Sorry. This is not to say that, for example, Pol Pot's life is an overall good or admirable life, of course, rather the opposite. I mean, I would say that extreme immorality makes a life fatally defective. But that doesn't mean also that this life can't be meaningful in an important sense, because it's related to some strong passions, projects, and even if they are extremely immoral in an important sense. But of course, the best life or a good life would have to go away, let's say, and I wouldn't call this a life that is good or admirable in an overall sense. Just to finish, I wanted to say something about the idea of how the totalitarian threat can affect to this idea of a good life. I'll be very brief and I'll be very sketchy, but I think there are something that can be said interesting. To me, or the idea would be, the question would be, how do sociopolitical conditions affect the prospect of a good life in each of these dimensions? Of course, it's not impossible to be happy or to find meaning in one's life or to be morally virtuous in an authoritarian or totalitarian regime. One can pursue her passions and projects as long as they are not incompatible with the regime's policies. Fighting against the adverse situation can indeed give meaning to one's life. Even it can set the conditions for moral heroism, which are absent in other circumstances. However, external goods, let's say, or the social political conditions are important. I think there are, and I'll finish with this, there are some ways in which authoritarian or totalitarian regimes normally impact in a negative way in their citizens' prospects of a good life in these ways. One is the loss or lack of freedom, of course, coerced restriction in the kinds of projects in these regimes. There is a coerced restriction of these kinds of projects that one can pursue. Another thing is the loss of knowledge. Censure and misinformation impair our decisions, and and ignorance itself is a harm. It's not just that this lack of knowledge is a harm in itself. Another thing is this of moral degradation. These regimes tend to put individuals in moral and ethical situations, and in any case, they are not a positive stimulus towards virtue. But there is also a final way in which these regimes impact in our possibilities and our prospects for having a good life, which I would call a kind of an authenticity, which is that even if one's life projects actually accord or are compatible with the state's rule, with that authoritarian regime, there is a kind here of counterfactual freedom, in the sense that if one wanted to have a different project, the one project that you have, even if it's your project, there's a sense in which in as much as you couldn't do otherwise, there's here a problem of a clear problem of lack of freedom, or at least of an authenticity, in the sense that it's not all clear that this is your project in the strongest sense. Of course, this situation is a severe impediment to living a worthwhile life in all the different aspects that I try to characterize. And this is all. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very interesting report, Professor Rossell. And actually, your research is very similar in the problematics with mine. So hope to see you in our next events and hope for further cooperation with our organization and the University, Ivana Franko University, and the participants of the conference. Thank you very much. If anyone has questions, please reach Professor Rossel in the chat. And we move to the next speaker. Actually, that is also a video lecture that is provided by Dr. Uliana, MD, MPH, President and founder of Global Positive Health Institute.
Hello, my name is Uliana Leonov, and I am the president and founder of the Global Positive Health Institute. The Institute is focused on translating the science of positive psychology into practical tools for everyone, but particularly for health practitioners in healthcare settings. And on behalf of the Institute, I'm sending this message of peace and caring and flourishing to all. And I'm delighted to have this opportunity to share with you some science and thoughts and insights around positive psychology for mental well-being during turbulent times. I'll talk a little bit about the role of positive psychology in mental health, and then do a deep dive into some key tools for thriving, particularly through adversity, when we use these positive psychology approaches, and touch on a little bit about the applications and channels of delivery and future directions of research. What is positive psychology? As defined by Martin Seligman and his colleague Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, it is the scientific study of positive human functioning and flourishing on multiple levels that include biological, personal, relational, institutional, cultural, and global dimensions of life. It's about less emphasis on human deficits and fixing our pathology, and more emphasis on what is good and improving our well-being and leveraging and using our human strengths. I have a lifestyle medicine background and have been a leader and physician in lifestyle medicine for a number of years, and in the practice of lifestyle medicine, where we use a healthy lifestyle to not only prevent but treat many chronic diseases, lifestyle-related diseases, we see a very important role for positive psychology and positive emotions. The main elements of a healthy lifestyle, of course, are nutrition, physical activity, sleep health, social connectedness, and positive psychology activities related to the connectedness, avoiding and reducing stress, and avoiding risky substance use. And the foundation for those healthy behaviors is positive emotion, and positive psychology approaches can help boost that positive emotion. Through these healthy behavior changes, we can achieve total well-being and positive health, physical, mental, emotional, social, and spiritual health. Now, for this talk, I'm going to be focusing particularly, again, on positive psychology approaches for our mental health during very difficult times, during crises, during trauma. There is a large body of literature that links positive psychology with activities and mindsets that are created during suffering, during adversity, and during trauma. In fact, in one review, there were over 18,000 studies that looked at various positive psychology processes and how these processes are used to recover and rebuild from adversity. That includes things like mental toughness, resilience, hardiness, a sense of meaning, compassion, forgiveness, and post-traumatic growth. And we'll take a look at some of these. A couple of very specific examples are the use of character strengths, which is a large area of positive psychology, and how it moderated the relationship between political violence and post-traumatic stress disorder for young people who were exposed to lengthy periods of war and political conflict. So helping young people to use their character strengths really mitigated the negative effects of those kinds of exposures. Also, positive emotions, which are, again, is the foundation of positive psychology, can help create psychological resources, life satisfaction, optimism, and a sense of tranquility. And this has been found in surveys where they compared people who experienced the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks in the US. They compared them before and after, and those positive emotions made a difference in that psychological growth and having those psychological resources. So in times of adversity, we can still, despite those difficult times and challenges, live with dignity and purpose. And the positive psychology literature has shown this. There are studies of people who experience losses and trauma, grief, again, post-traumatic stress disorder and symptoms, exposure to violence and life-threatening events. And many people do endure successfully and move on successfully. They might have some initial disruptions in their functioning. They might have sleep problems, restlessness, cognitive disorganization, and much more. But over time, they do move on. And in fact, at least 50% of the people in these kinds of studies can endure trauma and come out stronger as a result of that experience that we call post-traumatic growth. So what is the role of positive psychology in mental health specifically? I really am grateful for this article by Dr. Lee Waters and her esteemed positive psychology colleagues on positive psychology in the pandemic that did a lovely review, and much of that review applies to well beyond the pandemic and all kinds of turbulent times, especially the kinds of times that we are dealing with now with war and other threats. And what they did was to divide the role of positive psychology in mental health into 3 buckets. First, there's buffering, which is that positive psychology can help diminish psychological ill health during crises. Then there's bolstering, where positive psychology can help maintain and promote mental health despite the crises. And then there's building, which is that through the crisis, we are transformed and our mental health is actually even better, and it gives us the resources for improved mental health in the future. And that is because through the crisis, we may have learned new activities, for example, greater use of our strengths. We may have learned new mental processes, such as more self-compassion, and we may have garnered new perspectives, like an enhanced sense of meaning. So we're going to dive into some of these areas of positive psychology and their role in trauma and adverse experiences. And again, I'm starting off with positive emotions, first and foremost, which underlies the entire field and is the driver of the benefits of a positive psychology science and how we can apply it. And before I dive too much deeper, I want to emphasize that positive emotions can coexist with negative ones. So just because we are talking about boosting joy and love and these kinds of positive emotions during this global crisis does not mean that we're going to be turning away from emotions of fear and grief. Positive psychology is not about only having positive emotions. Positive psychology is about our humanity. It's about our full range of emotions, what we call emo-diversity, and embracing all of what we experience, having a self-compassion for that, and then doing what we can to shift our attention and focus and activities to the extent possible to more positive ones. And even in our brain, positive and negative emotions are not mutually exclusive. They're not on the same spectrum. They actually function in different areas of the brain on different levels of that two levels of spectrums. And one is more around the range of negative emotions that comprise mental illness, and the other is on the range of positive emotions and comprise positive health and positive well-being. And the emotions within those can be quite fleeting, and that's why we are able to actually experience both. So patients who have depressions, for example, can experience moments of joy. And those moments of joy can add up to build and bolster some satisfaction. And in fact, in our daily lives, to the extent that we can increase our positive emotions, this helps us in current times to improve our mental health, but also in that building capacity to be prepared to better manage our mental health during challenging times. Emotions are fleeting, so positive emotions are fleeting. Again, even in mental illness, depression, for example, or during very difficult times, we can have these flashes of positive emotions, of joy, gratitude, serenity, high interest in others, and hope, pride, amusement, inspiration, a sense of awe. And even if we can just experience those emotions for fleeting moments or seconds, if we can have a number of those throughout our days, throughout our time, that adds up to contribute to our health and well-being and our overall perspective on life and life satisfaction. Now, a special kind of positive emotion is positivity resonance. It's when two people co-experience these pleasant emotions together and with mutual caring and synchronies, meaning at the same time they are experiencing these positive emotions. And through that, there's this positivity resonance, which is not only emotionally beneficial for both people or even a group of people that are simultaneously experiencing these positive emotions, but physiologically they have that benefit at the same time of the improved emotions having an impact on lowering their blood pressure, lowering their cortisol, lowering their blood sugars, for example. And we'll talk a little bit more about that a little later, because social connections are such an important positive psychology tool. But the bottom line is that positive emotions are fundamental to our well-being, and they change the way our human brain works by broadening our cognitive awareness. And especially during times of crises, we need those positive emotions to broaden our awareness and our cognition, perhaps even to survive. It gives us some ingenuity and new ways of thinking that may get us out of tight situations. Positive emotions allow us to take in more information that does help us build on resources to help us with coping during adversity. And Barbara Fredrickson and other positive psychology researchers have also looked at these upward spiral theory or upward spiral dynamic, which is reciprocal. So as we have good fortune and or do certain positive psychology based activities and boost our emotions, then over time, through this broadening and building of our cognition, adding more resources, being more aware of our surroundings in a positive way, looking at opportunities in a positive way, we are able to over time, create even more good fortune for ourselves. And it is this upward spiral, because as the good fortune, we have more positive emotions. Positive emotions allow us the resources to build more good fortune. And in this case, we're talking about good fortune can literally mean life or death in situations of war and crises, where perhaps you're able to think more broadly and get yourself out of very tight situations. So with that, I would like to thank you very much for listening to this talk. I wish you peace and flourishing. If you would like to learn more about the Global Positive Health Institute or connect with us and partner with us in any way and collaborate, please reach out. We've got our website at positivehealth.world. We're on Facebook and Instagram. We're putting together a YouTube series, podcast series, and you can reach us and reach me at gphiconnect@gmail.com. Thank you again, and I wish you well. Be safe, be healthy, flourish, and I hope to meet you sometime. Take care.
In these difficult days, and I wish we can live in a happy world and peace people, with peace people. So I want to share my screen and my presentation. If you see, can you see this or not?
Yep.
Yes, yes, that's very good. Now, the title of our work is Truth is Waiting for Happy People. Now, any sphere of science is necessary to gain a happy future. Science and the process of looking for something new is a source of happiness. When we try to find something hidden from our eyesight, or even if it's somewhere next to us, we still need to shrewd eye of a scientist and throughout research to see it. Our coming to this world is meaningless if we are not struggling for happiness, said one great Greek man. And no matter how strange it may seem for us, history is a wide branch of sciences that combine all interdisciplinary studies and show us a direction which is the best path leading towards the happiness from the mankind. Peoples of the world listen to history as it is the best advisor to displace where, when, how, and why this or that developments took place, and at the same time give us the possibility to decide how to act today, how to solve the facing us problems better than we would have done in the past. Let us look into the history, listen to this pulse, and it would inevitably show us where to look for the key to happiness. The main aim of our report today is to present Trousseau, a small part of our country. Sorry, it is not going to the next slide. I want to show. Now this is Trousseau, a small part of our country, hidden in the high mountains of the Caucasus, that might become a source of happiness for those who visit this wonderful place and encounter its rich and diverse history. This is not just one part of our country. Its role in the system of strategic security of Georgia is very important. As you may know, Georgia, due to its geopolitical, economic, and social factors, was a place of migration for different ethnic groups throughout the centuries. Over time, part of the migrants blended with the locals or other ethnic groups, while the rest managed to preserve their ethnic identity almost intact. This process was particularly tangible in the border zone regions of Georgia. Among them is one of the oldest Trousseau Gorge. This is also Trousseau. The Trousseau Gorge is a rather rich and interesting place with its historical past, its socio-economic and political meaning, the lifestyle of the local population, and its material and cultural developments. The importance of the region has dramatically increased in the realm of the strategic security of the modern Georgian state. The work is based on the method of comparative analysis of historical source, the study of documents, and content analysis. Historically, the Trousseau Gorge has always played one of the most important roles in the defense system of Georgia. Today, thanks to its location, it has the same meaning for present-day Georgia. It is situated at the slope of the natural border of Georgia, at the northern slope of the main ridge of the Caucasus Mountains, at the mouth of the river Terek, and it's the composition of Khazbegi municipality of Mtretam-Tianeti region. Consequently, it borders part of Russia, namely Alania, the Republic of North Ossetia from the north, and occupied by the Russian Federation, Georgian municipalities of Akhalgori and Java, from the southwest and the west, and finally in borders to Sheti municipality from the southeast. According to Georgian and foreign sources, the Truso Gorge from ancient time has been in the composition of the Kakheti kingdom that was formed at the end of the 4th and the beginning of the 3rd century before Christ. Of course, we are not able to cite all the sources and scientific discussion because it will take a long time, and I will try not to take a long time. So we can say about the subject, if you are interested, you can read when it would be published. So our goal here is to observe Truso as one of the most important strategic regions of the history of Georgian statehood and every stage of its developments. So is it true that up to the one part of the 18th century, there is no information about the non-Georgian population in Truso, in Georgia, and foreign narrative works and historical sources? According to the notes of the famous Georgian historian Vahushti Bagrationi, in the first half of the 18th century, there is a blended composition of the population in Truso. They are represented in the following way: the locals, the Dvals, and the newcomers, Ossetians. But since the second half of the 18th century, migration of Ossetians received a permanent character. According to Georgian historic documents, sometimes Kakheti kingdom rulers would facilitate the migration of Ossetians to ensure the settlement of the abandoned territories of the improvement of economic conditions. They would have created favorable conditions for the settlement of Ossetians in Georgia, giving them lands under the crops, the houses, as well as some food for the new settlers. Thus, it can be said that the kingdom itself facilitated the full integration of Ossetians that lived there into the local political space of Georgia. Ossetians themselves were aware and appreciated the support and attention of the royal court. After the annexations of the Kakheti kingdom by Russia in 1801, there were some anti-colonial upsprings, and Ossetians would have joined the Georgian rebels in the struggle against the Russians. Later rebellions of Ossetians received a systematic and irreconcilable character. Thus, Truso nowadays, we can say that Truso, one of the empty population, there are about 70 deserted villages there. The first massive migration of Ossetians from the court started at the end of the 19th century, that it registered by the Russians. On the territory of Georgia remains through moved towards south of the lowlands. Part of them returned to their historical motherland, to Ossetia, present North Ossetia, Russian Federation. Leaving the gorge by the population was conditioned by a number of processes: self-climate, non-existence of the possibility of employment and education, low level of economic and social development of the region, and substances production that finally made the people leave the gorge. In the second part of the last century, Ossetians who migrated the North Caucasus and would visit the Truso Gorge, the place of their former habitat during of certain seasons, namely from spring to autumn, when beginning of the cattle, I will go to the next slide, of the cattle for spreading summer on pastures there. So later, lack of the prospects in the development of sheep breeding result in the malfunctioning of the branch of the occupation too. In the second half of the 80s of the 20th century, the movement for national independence that started in Georgia and in some republic of the Soviet Union would cause the inherent comment of the Soviet propaganda machine in borderline regions of Georgia, Abkhazia, so-called South Ossetia, and Truso, where lived a mixed ethnic population. It was coupled with the severe economic crisis of 1990s and the failure of the infrastructure that led to the isolation of the gorge from the central inhabited areas, and finally resulted in the migration of the population from there. The situation even more deteriorated with the 2008 Russian-Georgian war, which was followed by the closure of the Russian-Georgian border, largely checkpoint at the breaking of the diplomatic relations between these states. You may know that the claims of the Georgian territories of the Russian aggression of August 2008 and the occupation of Akhalgori have increased even more. Russian and Ossetian scientists and the press would launch and disseminate the false propaganda and information on this part of Georgia, presenting the Truso Gorge as ancient Ossetian territory. From time to time in the Russian language newspapers, we encounter the letters forged by the Ossetian authors and Ossetian civil organizations, where they claim that the Truso and Daryali gorges situated in Azbegi municipality, as well as the territory of the villages in the Kobe Basin, belong to Ossetia and thus should be included in the composition of South Ossetia. Even more, the map published of the website of Daryali show that Gori, Tskhet, and the military road of Georgia are within the borders of South Ossetia. These people completely ignore the interest of the local Georgian population, historically written documents, even in the sense of the documents completed by Russia, or the legacy of the Georgian population, the epigraphic monuments written in stone that are the collective historical memory and the true evidence of their cultural identity. When the Russian Empire and other big states talk about the state security issue, they should consider that the problems of security primarily stand before the small nations, and thus a violation of the borders of strategic from the defense, viewpoint regions, violence of sovereignty of these states. We believe that today when we have already had wonderful examples of the centuries-long history of mutual coexistence, relative ties and unity, the tension that had been accumulated by the interruption of imperial policy provokes and defends of the flames of the distrust between the Georgian and Ossetian people, thus creating the atmosphere of all-out disbelief and even more triggering the conflicts. These conflicts, apart from all other problems, are the main guiding axis of Georgian home and foreign policy even today. The present character of the topic is enhanced by the facts that display the constructive striving of Georgia, the country that gained independence in the 90s of the 20th century to lead the state policy in accordance with international norms and to solve the foreign policy issue of the country by peaceful resolution of the conflict, to ensure the state security, to integrity of strategically important regions and borders. Despite of immigration process Truso, as the old Georgian habitant has preserved the basic tendencies of the national culture. First of all, Georgian written culture and Georgian writing in the form of epigraphic monuments, the tower houses and the baked houses for defense purpose and many other characteristic mutual for Georgian mountain regions, as Swaneti, Khevsureti, Mtiuleti, and Tusheti, and artifacts that are found in Truso. The Truso Gorge, thus, is a remote part of our country and still so close and dear to us, with the 70 deserted villages that stand still as the guard and remainders of our history. As if the time has stopped in Truso, neither the dwarf and nor the Georgian origin or nor Ossetians live there anymore. One part of Ossetian would have returned to their historical homeland, other would have settled in different regions of Georgia. As for the dwarf, the ethnographic group does not exist, though their family names are still preserved in the Georgian onomastic in the form of surnames like Dvalishvili, Dvaladze, Dvali, and etc. Ossetians that stayed in Georgia live in different historical regions of the country and are actively involved in its political, economic, and cultural life. They are represented in the state management system, in scientific circles, in sports, business, and other spheres. They participate in the country's defense, represent Georgia at various international meetings and talks, scientific forums and sporting events, and their majority consider Georgia to be their homeland. Frankly speaking, is rather accorded for Georgians and Ossetians, the descendants of King Tamar and David Soslan, queens of Borin and Bordochan, the ones who have been tied with the oath of the loyalty throughout the centuries and managed to preserve our country, overcoming the historical calamities, when today the third part lectures us about the necessity of peace. While Trousseau, as a strategic region of Georgia and the area of Georgian Ossetian cultural diffusion still waits for the people who would care for the past and ensure the happy, successful future of the Gorge. Now, this was the end of my speech, and sorry as I could not pass the slides. You can see only pictures of Trousseau. I have said everything what is written here. This is Trousseau, wonderful part of Georgia. And I think that you will find happiness if you come and see this gorge. And I am very happy to be today with you. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Heroyam Slava. Thank you for your support. Very interesting report, and we do share similar problems with the common enemy, and we see that actually that is the Russian aggressor is the one who really hates people to be happy, those who have freedom, those who want to take care of their land, of their country. Aggressor wants to just destroy the life in order to, like, I don't know, to compensate its deficiencies. So thank you very much. And actually, I'm in love with Georgia. I visited your beautiful country in 2016. So I hope to come back one day, definitely. Thank you very much. If
Yes.
anyone has questions, please write in the chat. And I'm presenting the next speaker, who is Emma Bakaric, Master in Philosophy and Master in English Language and Literature, PhD student of the Department of Philosophy, Social Sciences and Education at University of Perugia, Italy, with a topic to present Diogenes and Minimalism, the modern answer to unhappiness caused by consumerism.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here. It's very nice to be able to speak with you, considering what is happening in your country, and I really wish to share my support, which is really the general support of the people of Croatia. Everyone I have spoken to, I've heard comment on the topic is absolutely on your side. So we're all hoping this will end soon. And as for my topic, the goal of my paper is to recognize minimalism as a resurfacing of some ideas of ancient philosophy, specifically the philosopher Diogenes of Sinope. Minimalism is a lifestyle that I believe has merit because it offers an alternative to mindless consumerism, which is the prevalent lifestyle in Western developed countries. Minimalism has appeared in recent years as a lifestyle that helps people to regain control over their lives when they're feeling overwhelmed by work, commitments, and expectations. Evidently, there is a significant number of people who feel unhappy with their everyday lives. This is an observation at this point. People are largely unhappy in rich Western developed nations, which seems illogical given the circumstances of their lives. So this is a problem that I believe should be explored. Why is it that so many people are unhappy when they live in objectively decent conditions? It seems that what most of us perceive as our personal failure to meet the demands of our specific situation is in reality a perfectly normal phenomenon in today's world, which is the phenomenon that no matter how much time and effort we invest in trying to get ahead, we simply cannot. And we seem to be continually buried under a mountain of obligations, expectations, chores, things to do. As long as we believe this is our personal failure, we will continue to overlook the fact that this condition is simply a product of the modern world. We live in a consumer society. Some of our colleagues here today have pointed out consumerism as part of the problem of one of the causes of unhappiness in the world today. Consumerism influences all aspects of our lives, even though most of us do not think about it until we reach our limit, until we feel overwhelmed and depressed. It has been suggested that adopting a minimalist lifestyle could be the solution to many of our modern problems. And while the people promoting this lifestyle are not philosophers, but instead people of various backgrounds who have personally experienced the benefits of minimalism, I believe the main ideas of minimalism can easily be found in the teachings of ancient Greek philosopher Diogenes. This is just another interesting example of how ancient philosophy can still be helpful, meaningful, and relevant in modern society if we remember to look to it for advice, of course. Depression and various other mental health issues have become so common and prominent in rich Western countries that it seems imprudent to consider those issues anomalies and look for their causes in people's personal lives and situations. It does rather seem that the issue is systematic, that there are foundational elements of modern society that cause this phenomenon. Depression and other mental health issues are diagnoses that generally correspond to an intense feeling of unhappiness, a lack of fulfillment, well-being, and stability in one's life. When this becomes a common occurrence, it brings into question the basic paradigm of our modern lives. If there is a foundational element of modern society that causes people to become deeply unhappy, then there is something fundamentally wrong with the way our society is structured. If we try to identify the fundamental structure in today's modern world, we will inevitably find that consumerism has shaped the way we function in the world today, and even the way we perceive the world and ourselves. Our everyday lives are subjected to the imperative of consumption. We invest our time and hard work in an attempt to satisfy our roles as consumers without consciously realizing this, and we are constantly in pursuit of the next purchase. Our list of needs seems to expand indefinitely, and we therefore continue to fall short of our own and society's expectations. If our main goal in life was to obtain a certain material object, while seemingly shallow, this goal would at least be attainable. The problem lies in the fact that a single purchase does not support consumerism as a system. Consumerism requires us to keep extending our list of desired material goods. Consumerism could not exist otherwise. And so naturally, it influences not only our economic structures, the free market, our institutions, it influences us personally, our psychology, our being. As astutely observed by philosopher Herbert Marcuse, people have become trapped in consumerism. Consumerism has embedded in us a need for consumption, a need that we can no longer identify as false because it subjectively feels as our own. While I have not observed an increase in popularity of Marcuse's philosophy, I have noticed that his ideas are appearing in public discourse in relation to a new so-called new lifestyle called minimalism. Minimalism is a method of reducing distractions in one's life in order to focus on what matters. Minimalism is an attempt to simplify one's life in order to gain more enjoyment and fulfillment And it involves becoming aware of the trap of consumerism. It gives us an alternative path, an alternative way to live. By consciously choosing to own fewer material possessions and decreasing their consumption, people have been able to free themselves from stressful obligations, from debt, from unfulfilling pursuits, and exhausting work hours. Consumerism has influenced our perception so that possession of material things is integral to our social status. But it is possible to become aware of this trap and choose to own less, despite the social pressure we will probably encounter. Stepping outside the popular crowd might be nothing new for those who are philosophers at heart, but it is a major struggle for most people, which is precisely why the consumerist system functions so well. The key is, as Marcuse observed, for people to develop a false perception of their own needs. Instead of fresh air, clean water, free time, and being surrounded by nature, we value material possessions to the point that we not only perceive all these needs as equally important, but we actually forget about our real needs and focus only on the false needs for consumption. The lack of focus on our actual needs, such as free time and proximity to nature, may still damage us deeply, even if we are not aware of it, which is, in my opinion, why so many mental health issues have an undefined cause. Far too many cases of mental health issues are simply blamed on genetics, while the fundamental structure of modern society that places unnatural and overwhelming burdens on us is not identified as one of the possible causes. As a society, we overvalue material possessions and consequently glorify busyness as a commendable trait, while rest and relaxation are perceived as problematic and indicative of laziness. This is contradictory to the understanding that rest and relaxation are among our fundamental needs, which means that the pursuit of goals dictated by consumerism prevents us from fulfilling our real and fundamental needs. Another product of constant busyness in pursuit of material goals is the lack of time for pursuing meaningful non-material goals. This can include a lack of intimacy in our closest relationships, as well as a lack of activities meaningful to us, such as volunteering, helping our community, or self-improvement. As all these phenomena occur at once as a consequence of living a normal life in the modern world, there seems to be more than sufficient cause for a development of a health problem such as depression. The basic paradigm of our modern world, as dictated by consumerism, leads us to investing all our time and energy into a pursuit that does not give us true satisfaction, and at the same time divests us of the time and energy necessary for activities that we actually need to be happy. Fortunately, some people have started to understand the underlying causality in our common lack of happiness, and through making changes to their own lives, discovered that their time and happiness can be reclaimed once we free ourselves of the demands of consumerism. The message of minimalism is that by choosing to stop investing so much of your time and energy into material possessions, we can reclaim our lives and discover the freedom to spend our time and resources on what is meaningful and truly fulfilling. Minimalism seems to be working for many people, and as there are no strict rules to follow, and it is not very difficult to understand and implement, so the popularity of the idea is growing. The main idea is that the fewer material needs we have, the more freedom we gain, and this idea, of course, is nothing new. The very same principle was taught by Diogenes 2,000 years ago. Diogenes lived with minimal material possessions to show that happiness was possible even without money or social status. It is always interesting for me to rediscover how relevant and useful the wisdom of ancient philosophers is. And of course, it is not necessary to adopt all of Diogenes' extreme lifestyle choices for this one principle to be beneficial. As evidenced by the people who have found happiness through moderate versions of minimalism without resorting to homelessness and living in a barrel like Diogenes did, happiness is still attainable in the modern world if you are able to resist the pressures of consumerism and expectations of society and focus instead of what truly gives meaning to your life. Thank you for your attention. That's it for me.
Thank you, dear Emma, for your presentation, and hope to see you next time and many more times to cooperate with you. Thank you for an interesting report, and please, dear colleagues, you can write your comments and questions in the chat. And I will present your topic, relationship between education and happiness. Tamar Kanashvili is a PhD student, positive and transcultural psycho consultant, Georgian Technical University, Tbilisi, Georgia.
Thank you very much. Hello once again, dear glorious Ukrainians. Today is the 20th of March and we should have been celebrating International Day of Happiness. But until war is not over in Ukraine, this day stays as a day, not as a fact. And I do believe that today our thoughts, mind, heart belongs to brave Ukrainian people, and no happiness exists when peaceful nation is attacked and children are killed. Well, today my mission is to present scientific article about relationship between education and happiness, and to answer to the crucial questions such as, are higher level of education related to higher level of happiness, or does education rather harm or well-being by raising aspirations? And I want to thank organizers for in such crucial situation to organize such a great event that we have today. So thank you very much. Now I'm going to share a presentation to make it more evident, and I will be very direct and straight. I know it's a late evening, and thank you for your patience. So here we are.
Yes,
I hope that
you can see the
presentation is visible to you. So relationship between education and happiness, and to answer the question, what is the link between happiness and education? So if we consider that happiness is having a meaningful life and it's not only pleasure, then happiness and education has a core mutual goals. And research suggests that for most educated people within societies are only happier as long as their education yields them as a transparent status of advantage. So if educated person feels valued, that education is the common value for society, then this person feels self-realization, and not only considering only pyramid of Maslow, but latest researches, educated people feel happier in society where they can have a status advantage as the education one. In a survey conducted by us in Georgia in 2019, so before COVID and before war, even worse, it had been found out that educational activities levels are associated with higher expectations, and they do not coincide with outcomes with the market. Individual eventually feel dissatisfied, and negative relationship between education and satisfaction are going to be observed. This outcome is especially likely for people with higher levels of education who tend to figure out under more competitive conditions. I hope I'm not too fast. Having made an even bigger investment in human capital during crisis, the individuals are hold bigger expectations toward the task market. When there is crisis or when there is the war, educated people feel more depressed, because brave people has a physical capacity, and education people's capacity are their mind. In the framework of paper, we found out the most interesting studies which showed that 8 weeks training has been shown to be more effective in reducing depression than strong antidepressants. So when I made an MBA thesis and we had a strong research, a lot of people considered as the training and self-development as the, how to say, as the motivational part. So sometimes trainings are associated with the happiness when people attend, listen, and feel their development. So connection between education and happiness is important in the educational system and can bring a huge value. So what are recommendations based on researches, based on studies to increase employees' engagement and reduce depression, to support employees to take part in trainings and self-development, to give time to employees to continue their studies. And almost in worldwide, more than 80 organizations were involved in the form of education and training, and they named as important and key factor to job satisfaction. We all may agree that that's not everything for employees, and happiness doesn't only consider trainings or not only education system, but this is at least one thing that definitely companies can and should do. Thank you for your time. I'll be always very happy to cooperate with you, and it's my honor to present today's topic. Regarding to any questions, regarding to anything, I will be always available for you. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much as well for your presentation. And hope to for further cooperation. Definitely, we are also very interested in education and happiness correlation. And actually, last year we started to work with schools, because definitely schools, that is the first place where we can teach pupils and teachers to be happy.
And next year, hope to host you in Georgia, and maybe even a closer one. I'm founder of Trainers Association, president of Trainers Association, and we have cooperation with more than 55 organizations, training organizations. So we'll be very glad to continue further cooperation with you, and you're welcome in Georgia.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a pleasure to meet you, and we'll keep in touch. Thank you very much. And we move to our last speaker, who is Associate Professor John Techedor. I hope I'm pronouncing in a correct way. PhD, Department of Philosophy, University of Valencia, Spain, who is going to present a topic, Conditioned Responsibility, Democracy and Belonging.